Hey there. Tonight's story might not soothe you right away, but it will pull you in. This isn't a tale of gods on their thrones or heroes in shining armor. It's about the things that made them tremble. The beasts, the curses, the nightmares that haunted the edges of ancient Greece, and sometimes wandered straight through the middle of it. If this kind of storytelling helps you relax, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly helps you drift off. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. There's something oddly comforting about knowing who else is wandering through mythology at this hour. So dim the lights, pull the blankets closer, and let us begin with the most terrifying monsters in Greek mythology. Settle in now. Let the day dissolve into dusk. The flickering shadows on your walls are just that, shadows, and that low rumble in the distance, merely the wind, not the stirring of something ancient, certainly not the writhing tail of a creature vast enough to block out the stars. But if you were an ancient Greek, oh, you'd be less certain. Because in their world, beneath the orderly surface of Olympus and polished marble columns, there was always something seething, something beneath, something monstrous. And at the very bottom of that bestiary, lounging like a volcano on its day off, was Typhon. Typhon, or Typheus, if you prefer his more dramatic stage name, was no minor menace. He was the apocalypse with scales. The end of everything wrapped in a storm cloud. The Greeks had an unusual habit of imagining their gods and monsters as part of a large, complicated family. One where every holiday gathering would require a sacrificial goat and several emergency escape routes. Typhon, appropriately enough, was born late into the cosmic family drama. His mother was Gaia, the earth itself, who, by the time of his birth, had already grown rather irritated with how Zeus and the Olympians had overthrown her children, the Titans. Gaia was a great mother, yes, but also a terrible mother-in-law. In her fury, she mated with Tartarus, the endless chasm beneath the world. Not exactly a romantic partner, but then, love stories in Greek mythology do often begin in a pit. The result of this liaison was Typhon, a creature so vast, so unspeakably terrifying, that even the Olympians reportedly fled at the sight of him. Now, to describe Typhon properly, one must abandon the usual measurements of biology. The poet Hesiod, a reliable source if ever there was one for intergenerational trauma in divine households, tells us that Typhon was so tall that his head brushed the stars. His arms stretched east and west, and his eyes glowed with fire. From the waist down, things got particularly festive. A mass of writhing, venomous serpents in place of legs, hissing and snapping like a particularly hostile maypole. But wait, there's more. Each of his many mouths spoke in different voices. Sometimes human, sometimes bull, sometimes lion. And at times, the cacophony of it all would erupt into the sound of thunder, the roar of a volcano, or the shriek of a gale-force wind. In short, he was the entire weather forecast in one very bad mood. Now, Zeus, ever the confident patriarch, had already dealt with the Titans. He'd cast Cronus and his kind into Tartarus, and established a shiny new world order atop Mount Olympus, complete with thunderbolts, cloud palaces, and ambrosia brunches. Then Typhon rose. One could imagine the Olympians, halfway through a celebratory feast, looking up to see a sky-darkening silhouette approaching, and realizing that perhaps they'd celebrated a bit prematurely. In most accounts, all the Olympians save Zeus fled in terror, transforming themselves into animals and galloping off into Egypt, where their disguises would later spark local myths. This, dear listener, is why you'll sometimes find Greek gods suspiciously resembling Egyptian ones. A kind of divine witness protection program, really. Zeus, to his credit, did not flee, at least not immediately. He met Typhon in battle. Lightning clashed against storm. The skies tore open, mountains shook. Poets, one imagines, reached for their scrolls. But here's the twist. Typhon won the first round. Yes, the king of the gods himself was overwhelmed. Typhon tore the sinews from Zeus's hands and feet, quite literally de-limbing the ruler of Olympus, and imprisoned him in a cave. There, Zeus was guarded by the she-dragon Delphine, who no doubt thought this arrangement perfectly fair. It was only with the help of Hermes and Pan, yes, Pan, the musical goat man, who apparently moonlighted as a rescue operative, that Zeus was freed. And once he had his tendons back, thank you Hermes, he regrouped. The final confrontation occurred on Mount Etna, in Sicily, where Zeus unleashed the full fury of his thunderbolts. Typhon fell at last, buried beneath the mountain, where his writhing fury still causes eruptions and earthquakes to this day. So if you ever visit Sicily and the ground trembles underfoot, don't worry, it's just Typhon rolling over in his sleep. All this fire and fury wasn't just a bit of mythological spectacle. The Greeks weren't merely spinning tales to keep children from misbehaving at bedtime, though one imagines it was extremely effective. Typhon served a deeper purpose. He represented chaos, raw, unrelenting, natural chaos. The Greeks were intimately familiar with earthquakes, volcanoes, storms, and all the unsettling little reminders that nature doesn't particularly care about dinner plans. Where modern minds might think of tectonic plates or volcanic pressure, the ancients imagined Typhon. It was a kind of poetry, and, quite frankly, more fun to envision than sedimentary subduction zones. And Typhon was not alone. He was, as mentioned, the father of monsters, with Echidna, half serpent, half something else entirely. He spawned a gallery of horrors. Let's take a brief inventory, shall we? Cerberus, the three-headed dog who guarded the Underworld. The Chimera, a fire-breathing fusion of lion, goat, and serpent. The Hydra, with its regrowing heads and poisonous breath. The Sphinx, whose riddles caused more than existential dread. The Nemean lion, whose golden hide couldn't be pierced by mortal weapons. And many others, who we'll meet again as our story unfolds. In a way, Typhon and Echidna are less a couple and more a factory, churning out monstrosities to populate the dangerous edges of the Greek imagination. But how did the ancients depict Typhon? Greek vase painters, never shy about ornamenting their wine jugs with a bit of divine trauma, occasionally gave Typhon a serpentine lower half and dragon wings. Others made him more human-shaped, though still terrifying. His form wasn't fixed, and that's important. Typhon wasn't just a character. He was an idea. He was the fear of the unknown, given just enough shape to haunt your dreams. In the Roman period, Typhon was sometimes merged with other storm deities. The Alexandrian poet Nonnos, writing in the 5th century CE, gave us one of the most dramatic retellings of the Typhon battle. A cosmic symphony of chaos and fury. Not exactly a lullaby, but splendid for dramatic readings. Interestingly, the Egyptians, never ones to miss a good mythic crossover, absorbed some of these ideas into their own cosmologies. The Greeks in Egypt, particularly in Alexandria, sometimes equated Typhon with the god Set, another chaotic desert dweller with a penchant for causing trouble. Cultural diffusion, ancient style. And what became of Typhon? Though technically dead, or rather buried, Typhon never truly left the stage. The volcanoes of southern Italy, particularly Mount Etna, were thought to house his furious breath. When lava poured from the mountain's flanks, it was Typhon's wrath escaping in molten form. In literature and later mythology, Typhon became shorthand for unstoppable destruction. A cosmic final boss. A being whose defeat marked the establishment of order. The victory of Zeus, not just as a powerful god, but as the upholder of structure over chaos. One might say, if a little sleepily, that Typhon is the reason the world doesn't fall apart every Tuesday. And yet, he's still there, sleeping, breathing, rolling over occasionally, just to remind us that the earth beneath our feet is never truly still. So, dear listener, if you're lying there now in the hush of your room, and you feel the soft hum of the world beneath you, remember, the ancients heard it too. They gave it a name. They gave it serpents for legs and fire for breath. They made it mighty. They made it monstrous. And then they tucked it safely beneath a mountain where it could do no harm, unless the mountain sneezed. We've only just begun our descent into the monstrous. There are more jaws to count, more riddles to solve, and more serpents than any garden would like. But for now, close your eyes. Let the tale of Typhon roll away like a receding storm. Let your thoughts settle like ash on a quiet volcano. The fire has dimmed. The monster sleeps. And so should you. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Let your breathing slow. Let the noise of the day soften, like a harp string falling silent in the dark. You're not in your room anymore. No. Tonight, you're drifting downward, deep into the quiet belly of the earth. Deeper still, into a place not quite mortal and not quite divine. A place where monsters are born. And waiting there, half in shadow, half in shimmer, is Echidna, the so-called mother of monsters. She's not famous, not like Medusa or Cerberus. No statues stand in her honour. No temples call her name. But without her, many of the nightmares in Greek mythology would never have drawn breath. She is old. Older than Olympus. Older than your pillow. Her story is scattered through scrolls and half-forgotten epics, like bones buried in mythic soil. But tonight, we gather those bones. Tonight we meet the mother. The Greeks, as you may remember, were rather fond of explaining the inexplicable with elaborate family trees. Earthquakes. That's Typhon tossing in his sleep. Madness? A gift from the Furies. A lion with skin too tough to pierce? Well, that's just one of Echidna's babies. She's described, when she's described at all, as half beautiful woman, half coiled serpent. The upper half is alluring, almost divine, and the lower half is a serpent's tail that gleams with oily scales, forever winding, forever listening. There's a certain poetic logic in it, the top to entice, the bottom to consume. Echidna was not just a mother in the physical sense. She was mythological fertility itself, the force that brought monstrous forms into being. She didn't simply give birth to one creature, or two, but to a whole ecosystem of terror. She was paired with Typhon, and what a pair they made. Between the two of them, they birthed virtually every beast that ever gave a Greek hero heartburn. You already know some of their offspring. Cerberus, the three-headed hound who guarded the gates of the underworld like a bouncer at the most exclusive club no one wants to enter. The Hydra, who added heads faster than you could chop them off. The Chimera, a fire-breathing hybrid so confused it probably needed a map just to walk. The Sphinx, the Nemean lion, Orthrus, the Caucasian eagle that pecked at Prometheus's liver day after day, all hers. Quite the maternity ward, really. But who was Echidna? And why did the Greeks imagine such a being? The answer, as always, lies in fear and fertility. In the ancient world, the wilderness was not a place for leisure hikes and panoramic selfies. It was dangerous, unknown, and crawling with things that hissed. Forests had bandits. Mountains had storms. Caves had gods or monsters, or the gods of monsters. And beneath it all, there was a powerful belief that nature, wild nature, gave birth to the things that frightened you. Echidna was the personification of that belief. She was the wild-made womb, the fertile chaos that lay just beyond the edges of the city-state. Not evil exactly, but untamed. She wasn't meant to be worshipped so much as respected, like the growl in the underbrush or the gleam in a predator's eye. Her name, Echidna, has uncertain roots. It's possibly related to the word for viper, or perhaps it comes from even older languages, predating the Greeks entirely. She may be older than even the stories we use to explain her. It would suit her, being older than memory. Many primordial goddesses are like that, fading into the edges of the mythos while still holding everything together. Echidna doesn't take centre stage in many myths. She's rarely the villain. She's never the hero. She's simply there, breeding, waiting, lurking. And in that quiet, generative presence, she becomes one of the most powerful figures in the mythic world, precisely because she doesn't demand attention. She simply continues. In Hesiod's Theogony, one of the earliest and most influential Greek texts, Echidna is described as a nymph who lives in a cave, devouring all men who pass. Now that could be metaphorical, or perhaps she simply liked her snacks fresh. Either way, she was clearly not someone to meet on a stroll. According to Hesiod, she was immortal and ageless, which is rather unfair for a mother of so many. But then Greek immortality never did come with stretch marks. She lived in a hidden cave, far from the gods and men, tucked away near Arima, a place whose location even the Greeks weren't too sure about. Some said it was in Cilicia, in southern Anatolia. Others pointed to deep beneath the earth. Some, quietly, just avoided the subject. And yet, despite her shadowy role, her presence is felt in nearly every heroic tale. Think of the great monster slayers of myth: Heracles, Bellerophon, Perseus, Odysseus. Nearly all of them faced one of Echidna's offspring. Each heroic deed, each monster conquered, was an echo of her legacy. She is the challenge behind the story, the breath behind the beast. There's something maternal in that too. You see, in ancient Greek society, women were often confined to the home, invisible in the public record, but absolutely central to the survival of the family and the continuity of culture. Echidna mirrors this role, silent in the myths, but essential to their progression. The mother whose children define the trials of men. Some later authors gave her a bit more narrative flesh. In the Roman tradition, she sometimes partners not with Typhon, but with Tartarus himself. A being, or a place, depending on how poetic you're feeling. Some even claimed she gave birth to a line of mortal monsters. kings and queens who ruled in far-off barbaric lands. In this version, her blood seeped into the earth and bore empires, which, in its own way, might be the most frightening legacy of all. In art, Echidna appears only rarely. The Greeks, bless them, preferred to depict her children. Flashier, more dramatic, and easier to fit onto pottery. But when she does appear, she's unmistakable. A woman from the waist up, beautiful and often bare, with the lower body of a serpent coiling into the gloom. Her face is calm, unapologetic. She is not a monster writhing in agony. She is not begging to be understood. She is simply Echidna. And what a strange power that is, to be monstrous without remorse, to be feared but not villainous, to give birth to terrors and never ask forgiveness for it. In modern times, her name has survived in biology. The echidna, a spiny anteater from Australia, bears little resemblance to her mythological namesake, aside from being wonderfully peculiar and producing the sort of confusion that would make a Greek storyteller proud. It lays eggs. It has four-headed reproductive anatomy. It is shy, ancient, and seems entirely unaware of how absurd it looks. One suspects Echidna would be flattered, but back to her myth. Echidna's story fades gradually after the early sources. As Greek thought shifted from oral epic to philosophy, monsters like her were explained away. Natural causes. Allegory. The torchlight of logic was being turned toward the dark corners of myth, and many of those shadows scattered, but not all. In the Renaissance, and even in modern fantasy literature, the trope of the mother of monsters lives on. You'll find her echoes in Tolkien's Ungoliant, in Lovecraft's Shub-Niggurath, in video games and novels, and the minds of anyone who's ever wondered, but where did the first monster come from? It always comes back to Echidna, because even now, when the world is mapped and measured, and most of the dragons have been replaced by tax forms, we still feel that tug at the edges. That sense that something wild, something ancient, still breeds beneath the surface. The Greeks gave that feeling a name. They gave it a shape. They gave it a mother. And so, as you lie there tonight, drifting just on the edge of sleep, know that you are not alone. The cave still waits. The coiled tail still stirs. And the mother of monsters still dreams beneath the earth, birthing horrors in her sleep. She does not roar. She does not chase. She simply exists. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying thing of all. Now close your eyes. The world is quiet. The monsters are fed. And the mother is resting. So should you. Breathe in. Let the weight of the day fall away like sand through your fingers. You're not here, not really. Not in your room, not in your bed. No, you're walking through a darkening meadow under a silver moon, a cool mist curling around your ankles. Ahead, a black river winds across the land like a ribbon of ink. And just beyond it, a gate. Massive, unmoving, ancient. And beside it, the soft growl of something that does not sleep. You have come to the edge of the world, or at least the edge of the world as the Greeks imagined it. This is the entrance to the Underworld, and the creature standing guard has 3 heads, each hungering for the soul of a trespasser. Meet Cerberus, the Hound of Hades. Now let's set aside modern expectations. Cerberus is not evil. He is not a villain. He doesn't chase heroes through city streets or bark in nightmarish alleyways. No, he is far more dignified than that. He has a job, a role, a purpose. He is the guardian, the doorman, the final obstacle. And he's very, very good at it. Cerberus, sometimes spelled Cerberus, if you're in the mood for older spellings, was the child of Echidna and Typhon, a sibling to the Chimera, the Hydra, and other such charming playmates. But Cerberus was special. He wasn't designed to terrorize mortals or rampage through the countryside. He was created to keep the dead in, and the living out. His appearance varies, depending on which ancient source you're reading or which pot you're peering into. But the basics are consistent. Cerberus has 3 heads, though some ancient authors claim as many as 50 or even 100. He has a mane of snakes, eyes like lanterns, and sometimes, depending on the poet's mood, a serpent for a tail. He's like a canine jigsaw puzzle made from nightmares, stitched together with divine purpose. But let's focus on the 3 heads. Why 3? Well, scholars and sleepy philosophers have debated this for centuries. Some say the 3 heads represent the past, present, and future, which would be terribly poetic for a dog. Others suggest they symbolize birth, youth, and old age, our body, soul, and spirit. Or perhaps the ancient Greeks simply thought 3 heads were more terrifying than 1 and left it at that. Now imagine it. A creature with triple the teeth, triple the growls, triple the stare, and yet not malicious, not unkind, simply resolute. You see, the Greeks didn't fear death the way we sometimes do, not as an ending, but as a passage. What they feared more than death was imbalance, disturbance, the wrong soul in the wrong place. Cerberus ensured order. No soul escaped the underworld. No living foot stepped too far. He was, in essence, the boundary. You may be wondering, what was it like, this underworld? It was not fire and brimstone. No pitchforks, no eternal torment. At least not for most. The underworld was quiet. Diamond Soys shadowed. A place of memory more than suffering. It had regions, of course. The blessed went to the Elysian fields, green and gold with eternal ease. The punished were sent to Tartarus, where monsters and titans writhed, and the rest simply wandered. Shades among shades. Cerberus guarded them all. But as with all good monsters, he did occasionally face opposition. After all, Greek heroes were a meddlesome bunch, always leaping gates and barging into places they had no business being. Take Orpheus, the musician. He played his lyre so beautifully that even stones were said to weep. When his wife Eurydice died, Orpheus descended into the underworld to fetch her back. He didn't fight Cerberus, he played for him. And the hound, overcome by the mournful melody, lay down his head and wept, or perhaps simply dozed. Either way, Orpheus passed. Then there was Heracles, or Hercules, as the Romans later called him, who was tasked with bringing Cerberus to the surface as one of his 12 labours. Not defeating him, mind you, just removing him temporarily from his post. Heracles, strong and stubborn as ever, wrestled the beast with nothing but his arms. No weapons, no tricks. He subdued Cerberus and dragged him into daylight, where the hound, unaccustomed to such brightness, blinked and howled in dismay. But Heracles was no villain. Once his labour was complete, he returned Cerberus unharmed to his post. Even heroes, it seems, understood the importance of boundaries. And then there's Psyche, a mortal woman who, through a series of divine misadventures involving jealous goddesses and impossible tasks, found herself journeying through the underworld as well. To pass Cerberus, she brought honey cakes, sweet bribes for a beast who, despite his job, still enjoyed a treat or two. Some say she tossed them one by one, each to a separate mouth. A very polite offering, really. These stories tell us something about Cerberus. He is not defeated by force, not truly. He is overcome by gentleness, by cleverness, by compassion. A lullaby, a cake, a fair challenge. He is a creature of rules, not rage, and that perhaps is why he was so respected. Even Hades, god of the underworld, had a sort of fondness for him. In many depictions, Cerberus is shown sitting at his feet like a loyal companion. Not chained, not whipped, just present, watching, waiting. And here we must take a brief, sleepy detour into etymology. The name Cerberus may stem from an Indo-European word meaning spotted, which means, if we're being terribly literal, Hades may have named his monstrous three-headed hellhound Spot. That's right, Spot. A joke, perhaps, from the ancient linguists. Or maybe just a reminder that even the most terrifying beings can have ordinary names. There's also a connection between Cerberus and ancient burial customs. You see, the Greeks often placed coins with the dead. Payment for Charon, the ferrymen who guided souls across the river Styx. But in some traditions, honey cakes were buried as well. Offerings not for Charon, but for Cerberus. A bribe to ease the soul's passage. A gift to the guardian. Something sweet for the sentinel. It's easy to forget, amid the snarling imagery, that Cerberus was not cruel. He didn't torment souls. He didn't hunt them. He simply ensured they stayed where they belonged. In a world where chaos was always licking at the edges of order, Cerberus was a gate that held firm. In Roman times, the image of Cerberus endured. Poets like Virgil described him in the Aeneid, where the hero Aeneas must also pass the hound to reach the realm of the dead. Again, the method is familiar. Soporific treats. Sleep, not struggle. And in later Christian adaptations, Cerberus became associated with demons or Satan's watchdog. But that's a different lens, painted in darker strokes. The Greeks saw no sin in his existence, only necessity. Artists over the centuries couldn't resist him. On urns, on mosaics, on medieval manuscripts, he appears, all snarls and scales and flicking tongues. Often with only 2 heads, sometimes with 3, occasionally with dozens. Always with a presence that says, here is the edge. Do not cross it lightly. And yet, of course, the best stories are about those who do. Still, once their business is done, the great heroes rarely harm him. They return him, leave him be. Cerberus is not the villain to vanquish, but the challenge to honour. There's something comforting in that, isn't there? A monstrous dog who does not chase but guards, who snarls not from malice but duty, who lets you pass if you are clever or kind or brave enough to earn the right. And as you lie there, perhaps with a dog curled at your feet or snoring down the hall, you might smile at the thought that in the ancient world, even the threshold between life and death had a guardian who wagged his tail for music and drooled for honey. Cerberus was terrifying, yes, but only to those who tried to cheat the rules. He never hunted the innocent, never strayed from his post. He stayed, eternal and watchful, at the gate, a beast of legend, a child of chaos, and still, somehow, just a very good boy. So rest now. The night is calm, the gate is closed, the guardian is at his post, his 3 heads laid gently on stone, watching the road behind you, keeping the silence intact. No need to run, no need to fear. You are not trespassing tonight. You are only drifting. Sleep well, and let Cerberus keep the watch. Let your body settle. Let the weight of your limbs fall into the mattress, like stones sinking gently into a clear pool. The night presses in softly, like a curtain drawn with care. And beneath that hush, somewhere distant, somewhere ancient, is the quiet ripple of a marsh. A breathless wetland, choked with mist. Something stirs beneath the surface. Something with too many eyes. Tonight, we drift toward the swamps of Lerna. There, in the stagnant, steaming waters, lived a creature so persistent, so impossibly difficult to kill, that it took a demigod with a club, a sword, and a bit of divine backup just to slow it down. This is the tale of the Lernaean Hydra, a creature of heads and venom, born of chaos and left to thrive in the shadows. You've probably heard of the Hydra, even if only vaguely. In popular imagination, she's become a symbol of problems that grow worse the more you try to fix them. Cut off one head and two more rise. A rather discouraging metaphor for anyone with a to-do list. But the Hydra wasn't just a metaphor. To the ancient Greeks, she was very real, and very much in the way. Her origins, as with so many monsters in Greek mythology, trace back to Echidna and Typhon, the mother and father of monsters. They didn't so much raise their children as release them, scattering their spawn across the map like little living challenges for the heroic youth of the age. The Hydra was one of their more impressive creations. She lived in the swamp of Lerna, not far from the city of Argos, and was said to be a massive, coiling, many-headed serpent. The number of heads varies depending on the poet. Some said 7, others claimed 9. A few, feeling especially dramatic, went as high as 100. But no matter the count, they shared one troubling feature. They didn't stay dead. When one head was severed, 2 more would sprout in its place, like an enthusiastic weed that took pruning as a personal challenge. And if that weren't enough, her blood was said to be so venomous that even its scent could kill. Her breath was toxic, her bite fatal, and the very ground she walked, or rather slithered, upon was poisoned. She didn't even need to chase her prey. They simply wandered too close, and nature did the rest. Now, Lerna itself was already a place of mystery. In Greek thought, it was one of the gateways to the Underworld, a liminal space where the veil between worlds was especially thin. The swamp, always still, always steaming, was feared for its depths and secrets. It was said that no one who entered came out unchanged, or at all. What better place, then, for a creature like the Hydra? When Heracles, known to the Romans as Hercules, was tasked with his second labour, it was not merely a matter of finding the Hydra and waving a sword. No, this was a test not just of strength, but of ingenuity. He arrived with his nephew Iolaus, who, depending on the version of the myth, was either his charioteer, his assistant, or just someone who'd made the mistake of tagging along on the wrong day. At first, Heracles did what Heracles does best. He swung his club. Heads flew, splendid cracks echoed through the marsh. But no sooner had one head fallen than 2 more pushed up from the bleeding stump, hissing with renewed fury. Imagine the frustration. One can almost hear Heracles sighing. It was going to be one of those days. The swamp around them boiled with Hydra fury. Heads darted, fangs flashed, and yet Heracles refused to retreat. Instead he adapted. With Iolaus at his side, he developed a new strategy, cauterization. Each time Heracles lopped off a head, Iolaus would dash in with a burning torch and sear the wound closed, preventing regrowth. Teamwork. Efficient, if a bit smoky. Eventually, only the central head remained, the immortal one. Yes, as if regenerating heads weren't enough, The Hydra had a head that simply could not die. Heracles wrestled with it, finally severed it, and buried it beneath a massive boulder. Because if you can't destroy something, at least make it inconvenient to access. To finish the task, Heracles dipped his arrows in the Hydra's blood, infusing them with a poison so potent that it would later spell doom even for other heroes. Those arrows would go on to kill the centaur Nessus, which in turn would lead to Heracles' own death. But that's a story for another night. What matters now is that the Hydra had fallen. The swamp went quiet, and the labour was complete. Well, mostly. In one version of the myth, Heracles was denied credit for the labour because he received assistance from Iolaus, which honestly seems a bit harsh. But the gods were nothing if not fond of fine print. Still, the tale endured. The Hydra became a symbol of impossible problems, ones that required not brute strength alone, but patience, precision, and a helping hand. A reminder that monsters often outnumber swords. But what did the Hydra mean, really? Why did the Greeks imagine such a creature? Part of it, of course, was the landscape. Swamps were feared in the ancient world. They were mysterious, disease-ridden, and impossible to navigate. They swallowed people without a sound. The Hydra, then, was a personification of the danger lurking in these places, a visible form for an invisible threat. But there's also a philosophical dimension. The Hydra represents the nature of struggle. Not all problems die when struck. Some divide, multiply, return fiercer than before. The ancient Greeks knew that. Their world was full of uncertainty, plague, war, famine, betrayal. You could win a battle and lose a kingdom. Solve one crisis and find two more waiting behind it. The Hydra, coiled in her marsh, was that truth made flesh. And yet, she was not unbeatable. It's tempting to think of Heracles as merely a brawler, but the Hydra reminds us that even he had to think, had to innovate, had to accept help. His greatest victories were never his alone. There's a lesson in that, gently tucked beneath the fangs and fire. The Hydra's legacy extends far beyond Greek myth. Her name has become a literary device, a political metaphor, a psychological symbol. In every era, people have faced Hydra-like problems, those complex recurring challenges that seem to multiply the more we engage them. And still, we remember the torch, the cauterization, the cleverness. In ancient art, the Hydra was a favourite subject. On painted amphorae, she coils and strikes, heads twisting like braids in the wind. Sometimes she is dragon-like, sometimes more serpentine. Heracles is always there, grim and sweating, club in one hand, torch in the other. The scene is dynamic, chaotic, but always frozen just before resolution. We don't see the moment of victory, only the effort. Perhaps that's fitting. In Roman times, the Hydra was reshaped a bit, more monstrous, less symbolic, but she never lost her place in the pantheon of horrors. Later, in Christian allegory, she became a stand-in for sin, for heresy, for whatever needed smiting with dramatic flair. But the essence remained, a creature that could not be defeated by ordinary means. In some Renaissance retellings, the Hydra became almost seductive, a feminine monster, part woman, part serpent, echoing older fears of the wild and the unknown. The swamp became not just a place, but a metaphor for desire, temptation, and danger. But strip away the centuries, and we return to the still waters of Lerna, to the mist, to the hiss. Imagine it now. You're standing on the edge of the marsh. The reeds part with a rustle. A low ripple moves across the water, and then a head, long, narrow, fanged, rises into view. Another follows, then another, until the night blooms with serpents. 100 eyes blink. 100 tongues taste the air. You take a step back, not from fear, but from awe, because this isn't evil, this is ancient power. Chaos wrapped in elegance. A puzzle, not a curse. And somewhere far off, a torch flares in the darkness. A hero steps forward, not to slay, but to understand. So rest now. The Hydra sleeps again in her swamp, coiled beneath lilies and mud. Her heads no longer hiss. Her breath no longer poisons. She dreams of fire and rain, of battles lost and won. And you? You are far from Lerna now, safe beneath your blankets, where no heads multiply and no blades are needed. The marsh is still. The torch is out. And the monster, like you, is at peace. Sleep deeply, and let the world remain quiet. Let the hush of the evening settle around you like soft wool. The air is still now. Nothing stirs except memory, and the faint echo of hooves on ancient stone. The stars above you are distant and patient, watching as they always have. But below, in the smouldering hills of a forgotten land, a creature once breathed fire into the wind. She was impossible, furious, and proud. Her name was Chimera. Tonight, we'll wander slowly through the scorched hills of Lycia, in what is now southwestern Turkey. But once, long ago, this was a place of legend, and in the cracks between rocks, where sulphur steamed from the earth, the Chimera waited. The Chimera was a monster built by contradiction. She was part lion, part goat, part serpent, a fusion of things that had no business being in the same body. And yet, there she stood, a lioness at the front, a goat rising awkwardly from her back, and a long, viperous snake forming the tail, coiled and hissing behind her. And if that weren't enough, she breathed fire. Of course she did. Greek poets described her with a mix of horror and admiration. A creature so unnatural she must have been divine. Or perhaps something the gods regretted and forgot to recall. She was, like many monsters of that ancient world, a child of Typhon and Echidna, which meant that chaos was not just her nature, it was her birthright. Her name, Chimera, literally means she-goat in Greek, which, considering she was also a lion and a snake, seems like an odd naming decision. But the Greeks often name things after their most confounding feature. And what could be more confounding than a goat erupting from the back of a lion? She roamed the burning hills and haunted the people of Lycia. They feared her as a wildfire, as a punishment from the gods, as something too powerful and strange to reason with. And truly, she didn't have an agenda. She didn't demand sacrifices, or build empires, or leave cryptic riddles. She just existed, and scorched everything around her. Now, why would a monster like this take root in Lycia? It helps to know a bit about the land. Lycia was known in the ancient world for its strange, flaming hills, places where methane seeped up from the earth and ignited into ghostly blue flames. Even today, at the site called Yanatash, flaming rock, fires still burn from the ground, flickering mysteriously. To the Greeks, such phenomena had to have a cause. Fire from nowhere? Clearly something monstrous was to blame. So they imagined the Chimera, a creature who breathed these flames and lived beneath the rocks. Myth, after all, is how the Greeks explained the impossible. The most famous story involving the Chimera comes from the saga of Bellerophon, a hero not as well known today as Heracles or Odysseus, but just as bold. Bellerophon was a prince, or possibly a fugitive, depending on whom you ask. He ended up in Lycia, under complicated circumstances, and found himself sent on a mission that was, frankly, meant to kill him. The king of Lycia, hoping to rid himself of this inconvenient guest, ordered Bellerophon to slay the Chimera. A clever way to dispose of someone without technically getting blood on your hands. "Oh, you're still alive? Splendid! Do pop out and kill the unkillable monster next, would you?" But Bellerophon, rather than succumbing to dread or excuses, went hunting. Now, it's important to note that Bellerophon had a secret weapon, or rather, a winged one. He had managed, through prayer, perseverance, and a golden bridle from the goddess Athena, to tame Pegasus, the winged horse. With Pegasus beneath him, Bellerophon could fly, placing him out of reach of the Chimera's claws, fangs, and, crucially, her fire. Imagine that scene. The Chimera stalking across the cracked earth, the goat bleating as flames pour from her jaws, the lion's roar echoing through the hills, and above her, wings beating like thunder, a man with a spear, circling, watching. He couldn't get too close. One plume of fire, and it would be over. But he couldn't stay above forever either. So he devised a trick. He fixed a block of lead to the tip of his spear. A strange choice, unless one is thinking several moves ahead. Swooping down, dodging a blast of flame, he drove the spear into the creature's throat. The lead, heated by her breath, melted down into her windpipe, suffocating the fire, and with it, the monster. It was not brute strength that won the day, but cleverness. Heat and metal. A smith's trick, not a warrior's. The Greeks valued that. Wit over muscle. Strategy over sheer force. In their world, heroes often triumphed, not because they were the biggest, but because they were the smartest. And so, the Chimera fell. The fire quieted. The people of Lycia breathed easier. Bellerophon returned, not just as a survivor, but as a hero, though, as with many Greek heroes, his story would not end so smoothly. He grew proud, too proud, tried to fly to Olympus itself, and Pegasus, wise beast that he was, threw him before reaching the heights. But that's another tale. The Chimera, for her part, was buried in the hills. The flames, some said, were her breath still leaking through the cracks of the earth. Even today, the fires at Yanatash still burn. Some believe them to be eternal. Others know they're just gas. But there's something undeniably haunting about flames that never die. In later traditions, the Chimera evolved. She was no longer just a creature. She became an idea. Chimera came to mean anything impossible, any fusion of things that should not exist together, a dream too strange to be real, a metaphor for excess. In medieval bestiaries, she was drawn with new combinations, leopard spots, dragon wings, human faces, always changing, always shifting, and in that sense, she became a reflection of our own imaginations. Chaotic, beautiful, terrifying. She also endured in art. On pottery and coinage, she appears snarling, breathing fire, claws arched. Usually with Bellerophon above her, spear drawn, the moment before victory, or the moment before something goes terribly wrong. The Greeks loved that tension, that breath between triumph and tragedy. And what of her deeper meaning? To the Greeks, monsters were rarely just monsters. They were warnings, reminders, reflections. The Chimera, with her 3 bodies and burning breath, might represent uncontrolled imagination, dreams without boundaries, or the dangers of hybrid things, Neither one nor the other, but both. A symbol of the unknown, of the unnatural. Or perhaps she was just a creature of fire, given form so that people might understand the earth they stood on. That, after all, is the quiet genius of mythology. It gives shape to confusion, a face to fear, a story to stand where silence once was. And so tonight, as you lie still beneath your own roof, centuries away from the hills of Lycia, you might picture her, the lioness pacing through blackened stone, the goat's head bleating and burning, the serpent tail twitching in anticipation. She is not coming for you. She never was. She was born, she raged, she was defeated, and remembered. That's all any monster asks. Now the hills are quiet, the fires dim. Pegasus flies on, and Bellerophon, prideful and fallen, is long gone. But the Chimera remains, not as threat, not as curse, but as story. Sleep now. The wings have passed overhead. The flame is just a flicker. The beast is at rest. And so are you. Close your eyes now. Let the soft tide of silence lap gently at the edges of your thoughts. There is no hurry, no weight of waking hours. Just the breath in your chest and the drifting stories of the old world. Tonight, we do not go underground or into the swamp. We do not follow lions or serpents or beasts with too many legs. No, tonight we gaze into eyes. Not yours, not mine, but hers. And if we are not careful, we may never look away again. This is the story of the Gorgons, and of one in particular. You know her name, even if you don't remember where from. It lingers in the back of the mind, like a warning from a dream. Medusa. Say it slowly, softly. The name is already an incantation. Now the Gorgons were 3 sisters, Steno, Euryale, and Medusa, and depending on which version of the myth you prefer, they were either always monstrous or became monstrous later. That's the thing about Greek mythology. Nothing is ever simple. Everyone has a past, often a complicated one. Let us start with the old versions, the ones that came before sympathy was invented. In these, the Gorgons were born monstrous, children of the sea gods Phorcys and Ceto, creatures of dread from the moment they took their first breath. They lived far off in the west, at the edges of the world, past the boundaries of maps and reason. They had wings of bronze, snakes for hair. Their skin was scaly, their teeth sharp, and their eyes could turn you to stone. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, literally. One glance, and your body would freeze in place, your breath would stop, and your soul would drift from flesh turned cold and grey. The Gorgons were not pursued, they did the pursuing, and no man returned from their lands intact. But then, a different version arose, a softer one with tragedy. In this telling, Medusa was not born a monster. She was a maiden, perhaps a priestess of Athena, dedicated to the goddess of wisdom and war. She was beautiful, so beautiful in fact, that even the gods noticed. And one did more than notice. Poseidon, god of the sea, desired her, and according to the myth, he pursued her. In some tellings, he seduced her. In others, he assaulted her, and not in a quiet meadow, but in Athena's own temple. When the goddess returned and found her sanctuary defiled, she did not punish Poseidon, she punished Medusa. Because in mythology, justice is not always just. Gods, after all, behave like people, which is often the most dangerous thing about them. And so, Medusa was cursed. Her hair became snakes. Her face, once lovely, became something unlookable. Not because it was grotesque, but because it was too powerful. She was given the gift, or curse, of the petrifying gaze. No longer a priestess, No longer human, no longer desired, she fled west with her sisters. And from that moment on, she was both feared and hunted. Now consider this. A woman punished for being beautiful, then hunted for being dangerous. There's something ancient in that rhythm, and sadly, something eternal. But back to the myth. You may remember the name Perseus, a hero with a magic bag and a knack for inconvenient quests, sent by a king who wanted him dead without saying so. "Bring me the head of Medusa," said the king, as if asking for a bouquet. And Perseus went, but not alone. He had help, divine help. The gods, for reasons of their own, gave him tools. Athena provided a polished shield, one that could be used as a mirror. Hermes gave him a curved blade. He also received a magical satchel to carry the head, and the winged sandals of the nymphs, with which he could fly. You may notice a pattern in Greek heroics. The monster is rarely defeated by brawn alone. There are tools, relics, rules. The Greeks understood that monsters were not simply strong, they were symbols. They had to be approached with reverence and cunning. Perseus flew to the edge of the world, to the land where the Gorgons slept. They slept during the day, you see. Their stone-turning eyes only worked when open. Even curses need rest. And as the Gorgons lay coiled among the rocks, Perseus crept forward, not looking directly, but through the reflection in his shield. It's a clever image, isn't it? He cannot face her directly. He must look through an image, indirect, safe, distant. One wonders how many truths in life must be seen the same way. With the curved blade, he struck, clean, fast. Medusa's head fell, eyes still open, still dangerous, and from her blood sprang two beings, Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a warrior with a golden sword. Life emerging from death. A symbol of beauty and violence, fused. Perseus placed the head in his satchel. It would remain a weapon. Even severed, Medusa's gaze could petrify. He used it to defeat foes, turn kings to stone, and eventually returned it to Athena, who mounted it on her shield. Now pause there. Athena, who cursed Medusa, who armed the man who killed her, who then placed her head on a shield and carried it into battle. Why? Why would a goddess wear the face of her victim? Some say it was guilt, a way to honour Medusa. Others claim it was pure practicality. The head was, after all, extremely effective. But maybe it's something else. Maybe Medusa had become more than a curse. She had become a symbol. In time, Medusa's image spread across the ancient world. Not as a monster, but as a guardian. Her face, the Gorgoneon, was painted on shields, carved into doorways, etched on coins and breastplates. Not to frighten the innocent, but to ward off evil. Apotropaic, the scholars call it. A fancy word meaning something that turns danger away. A reversal then, from hunted to protector, from cursed to divine. Her face twisted in rage, eyes wide, tongue protruding, became a kind of ancient alarm system. A declaration that the space behind the image was sacred, untouchable. How's that for poetic justice? And so, across the centuries, Medusa was reclaimed. Artists painted her not with scales and fangs, but with sorrow. Her hair was not snakes, but symbols. Her story was not one of terror, but of transformation. In the Renaissance, poets reimagined her. Painters softened her features. In the modern world, she became a feminist icon. The woman punished for her beauty, transformed against her will, then demonized for surviving. Is she still terrifying? Yes. But perhaps not for the same reasons. And what of her sisters? Stheno and Euryale, the immortal Gorgons, often go unmentioned. They weren't slain, they weren't cursed anew. They remained wild, winged, grieving. Their names mean strong and far-roaming. They were perhaps even more terrifying than Medusa, yet less famous. That too is a kind of curse, to outlive your sister and be forgotten. But somewhere, in the mythology between lines, they still fly. Not quite villains, not quite mourners, just shadows across the edge of the world. And here we arrive at the heart of it. The Gorgons, and Medusa in particular, are not monsters in the way we understand them. They are protectors, victims, warriors, goddesses. Their image, born of fear, becomes a kind of shield, not to harm, but to defend. Think of it. A face so powerful, it turns violence to stone. Not through fists, not through flame, but through the act of looking. What is more dangerous than a woman who cannot be looked upon, and who, in turn, sees everything? Tonight, let us not fear her. Let us imagine her not as a beast with snake hair and a bloodied stare, but as a figure walking the border of myth and memory. Not chasing you, not hunting, simply watching, guarding. Perhaps she stands outside your window now, not to petrify, but to keep watch, to hold back whatever else the night might bring. Sleep beneath her gaze. You are safe? The monsters she once faced are long gone, and she, Medusa, has become something else. No longer victim, no longer villain, but a quiet goddess of the threshold. And you, dear listener, are on the peaceful side of that line. Sleep now. Let the stone turn back to flesh. Let the hair become wind. And let her eyes, gentle now, close at last. Take a breath. Not too deep. Just enough to feel your ribcage gently rise like the tide beneath a quiet moon. Let your limbs go still. Your thoughts go soft. Tonight, we set sail. Not toward peace, not yet. Tonight, we pass between monsters. There is a place in the world where the sea narrows like a throat, and ships must slide carefully between high cliffs and deep waters. A place where every sailor knows that, to steer clear of danger on one side, he must come perilously close to disaster on the other. This place, very real, very present, is the Strait of Messina, between Italy and Sicily. The ancients knew it well, but they saw more than water, more than current. They saw jaws, they heard voices, they named the dangers that lurked there, gave them form and history and appetite. On one side stood Scylla, and on the other, Charybdis. If you were to ask an ancient Greek sailor which was worse, he might pause, shrug, and say, "Depends on how you'd like to go." Scylla lived in the cliffs. She didn't move much, just enough to ruin your day. She perched in her cave, high above the waves, and waited for ships to come close. And when they did, she reached down, fast, efficient, hungry. Homer tells us she had 12 legs, long and lean, stretching from her waist like some monstrous spider, and 6 long necks, each ending in a terrible head with 3 rows of sharp teeth. Her voice was like the yelp of puppies, pitiful and high, but her bite was something else entirely. She didn't tear ships apart. She didn't breathe fire or crash waves. Number. She plucked sailors from their decks like olives from a bowl, 1 for each head. 6 men gone before anyone could scream. Odysseus saw it happen. He'd been warned by Circe, the sorceress. Steer close to Scylla, she told him. You'll lose a few men. It's horrible, yes, but better than Charybdis. Charybdis will take the whole ship. And so he did. He clutched the tiller, teeth tight, and watched as Scylla struck. 6 men, lifted, flailing, screaming. Then silence. It was not a battle. It was a toll. And she took it, as she always did. But who was Scylla before this? There are stories, softer, sadder, that say she was once a girl. Not divine, not monstrous. Just a girl who walked the shores and loved the sea. And one day she caught the eye of Glaucus, a sea god. He loved her. She did not love him back. He, in desperation, went to Circe, begged her to make him irresistible. But Circe, you see, loved Glaucus, and Scylla, by simply existing, had ruined that love. So Circe did what goddesses so often do in myth. She punished the woman. She poisoned the spring where Scylla bathed. And the next time Scylla stepped into the water, she changed. Her body stretched, her legs twisted, dogs burst from her skin. She screamed, and kept screaming, until she found herself in the cliffs above the sea, no longer a girl, no longer anything at all. She wasn't evil. She just became. And she stayed. On the other side of the strait, the water boils. That is where Charybdis waits. You don't see her until it's too late. She doesn't have arms or teeth or eyes you can look into. She's just a shape in the sea, a whirlpool that opens 3 times a day and drinks the ocean. And if you're in the way, down you go. She was once a daughter of Poseidon, the stories say, loyal, proud. She helped her father drown coastlines and flood enemy lands. But Zeus, who had other ideas about balance and ownership, struck her with lightning. He chained her to the seafloor and cursed her with hunger. Now she swells and collapses, breathes in and spits out. Never full, never still. She is absence made visible. The kind of danger you only understand once you've been pulled in. So there you are. A sailor, a captain, a hero passing through. To your left, a towering cliff, still as death, with something sharp hidden in the shadows. To your right, water that pulls sideways, tugs at the keel, beckons with no promise of return. Pick one. You have to. Odysseus chose Scylla, because losing 6 is better than losing everyone. That's what he told himself. What Circe told him. What the gods would have him believe. It's a cruel math, but Greek mythology is full of that kind of arithmetic. The kind where survival always costs something. You see, Scylla and Charybdis weren't just monsters. They were choices. Bad ones. Scylla is the pain you expect. Swift, sharp, specific. You know it's coming. You brace for it. You live through it. Charybdis is the slow dread. The danger you try to avoid but feel pulling at your feet anyway. It comes quietly, like regret, like gravity. Scylla kills a few. Charybdis devours all. And together they represent something very old and very familiar. The truth that some journeys offer no safe path. That sometimes to keep going, something must be sacrificed. And yet, Odysseus passed through. Not untouched, not unscathed, but onward. That's the thing. Even in the face of ancient monsters, of losses and choices and waves that don't care if you pray, the Greeks believed you could keep moving. Even if it hurt. Even if the way was narrow. Even if you cried. You could still steer the ship. Later storytellers softened the edges. In some versions, Odysseus fights back, tries to stab Scylla as she grabs his men. But the gods laugh at that. You can't stab a choice. You can't strike a fate. You can only face it. Sail through, and remember. In art, Scylla is often drawn as a woman above, beautiful, serene, and chaos below. Dogs and serpents and limbs all braided into a single shape. A reflection of the sea itself. Calm on the surface, madness underneath. Charybdis is harder to paint. She's not a creature so much as a phenomenon. A gaping mouth, maybe. A swirling disc of foam. Sometimes just a hole in the sea. But everyone understood her. The sailors did, the poets did, and so do we. We use them still. Between Scylla and Charybdis, the phrase survives. A way to say I had no good options. A way to say I chose what hurt less. A way to say I'm still here. And that matters, because sometimes the victory is not in slaying the monster. It's in knowing which one to face. In knowing when to hold the tiller. And in not letting go. The ancient world was full of things the Greeks couldn't explain. Earthquakes, storms, currents, loss. But instead of surrendering to fear, they gave those things stories. Not to tame them, but to understand. They named their monsters. And in doing so, they named their fears. And their courage too. So tonight, as you lie in your bed, you are not at sea. You are not between rocks. There is no whirlpool at your feet, no jaws in the dark. You are safe, the strait is behind you. Scylla sleeps in her cave, curled around her sorrow. Charybdis turns slow and silent beneath a peaceful sea. And you? You are the sailor who passed through. Not unchanged, but still sailing. Let the wind go quiet. Let the water calm. The monsters, just this once, are still. Sleep now. And drift. You've already done the hardest part. It's quiet now. Let the hush of the evening wrap around you like a cool linen sheet, the kind worn by kings and commoners alike in the Mediterranean dusk. Imagine a torch flickering in some far-off corridor. Footsteps echo, marble beneath your feet, a door opening and closing behind you. And now you are in the dark, in the labyrinth. It does not matter how you got here, only that you have, and somewhere, at the centre of this winding puzzle of stone and shadow, waits the monster. Tonight we meet the Minotaur. Not just a beast in a maze, though that's how he's often remembered, but something far older, stranger, sadder. Let us begin at the beginning, which, as with most Greek myths, is not simple, not clean, and certainly not family-friendly. It starts with a king, a Cretan king named Minos. Minos wanted to rule not just men, but the sea itself. So he prayed to Poseidon, god of the oceans, asking for a sign to prove he was chosen. Poseidon obliged, sending up from the surf a magnificent white bull, powerful, radiant, divine. Minos was to sacrifice it as a show of loyalty. But Minos, being human, made the usual mistake. He got attached. The bull was too perfect, too beautiful. Surely the gods wouldn't mind if he kept it and substituted a lesser one for the altar. They minded. In particular, Poseidon minded. And as punishment, the god cast a strange desire into the heart of Minos' wife, Queen Pasiphae. She was struck with a longing, not for a man, not even for a god, but for the very bull her husband had refused to sacrifice. What followed was, depending on your level of poetic tolerance, either grotesque or tragically divine. The queen sought help from Daedalus, the great inventor, and Daedalus, as artists often do, obeyed the brief without judgment. He built her a wooden cow, hollow and lifelike, in which she could climb and, well, deceive the bull. And from that strange union came a child with the body of a man and the head of a bull, the Minotaur. He was unnamed at birth. The name we use, Minotaur, simply means bull of Minos, as if he were a possession, a problem to be solved. And in many ways, that's exactly what he became. The boy, if one can call him that, could not be raised among people. He grew quickly, grew strong, grew wild. Minos, horrified and shamed, again turned to Daedalus. And Daedalus built the labyrinth, a palace of corridors, a maze so complex that even the architect could barely escape it. A structure where left and right became meaningless, where forward became back, where one might walk forever and never see the same wall twice. In the centre, they placed the Minotaur, to live, or at least to exist. He was fed, he was feared, he became legend. Now, here's where Athens comes into it. At the time, Crete was a naval superpower, and Athens, still young and growing, had once rebelled, and lost. As part of the peace, Minos demanded tribute. Every 9 years, Athens would send 7 boys and 7 girls to Crete, and those youths would be placed in a labyrinth. With the Minotaur, no weapons, no guide, no escape. It wasn't execution, not formally, just a disappearance, a slow forgetting. They entered, they never returned, and so the Minotaur became more than a monster. He became the engine of fear, a reminder of defeat, a story told in Athens to keep young people obedient, a sacrifice to power and to shame. But then, of course, came a prince, Theseus, son of the king of Athens. Brash, clever, reckless. A walking definition of heroism, at least the Greek variety, which included equal parts nobility and ego. When the time came for the next tribute, Theseus volunteered to be among the youths. Not to die, but to kill, he sailed to Crete. And as the stories go, he caught the eye of Princess Ariadne, daughter of Minos and Pasiphae, half-sister to the Minotaur, if anyone was counting. Ariadne, moved by the handsome foreigner, or perhaps simply sick of the bloodshed, gave Theseus a tool. Not a sword, not a map. A thread. A spool of golden string to be tied at the entrance of the labyrinth. A guide back, if he could survive. Theseus entered. He walked the winding paths, let the walls close in, let the silence deepen. And finally, he found the creature. Imagine that moment. The hero face to face with the beast. And the beast, not roaring, not charging, just staring. Because here's the part the stories often skip over. The Minotaur didn't ask to be there, didn't ask to be born, didn't choose the labyrinth. He was made, then caged, then fed strangers in the dark. Was he savage? Yes. Was he a monster? Perhaps, but also perhaps not. Theseus fought him, killed him, left his body in the dark, and then following the thread, escaped. Victory. The end. But as with all Greek myths, the ending leaves questions. Who was the Minotaur, really? Some say he was simply a cautionary tale, a symbol of unnatural union, of pride punished by the gods. Others see him as something deeper, the unwanted child, the castaway, the embodiment of shame buried at the heart of power. In historical terms, there may have been something more. Archaeologists studying the ruins of Knossos, the grand palace of ancient Crete, have found vast, complex layouts, rooms upon rooms, corridors with no straight line. Some believe this was the labyrinth, not a trap, but a court. Not a prison, but a palace so complex that visitors felt lost. The bull too mattered in Minoan culture. Bull leaping was a sacred sport. The animal was revered, not feared. Its horns appear in art, on altars, in frescoes. So perhaps the story of the Minotaur is a Greek reinterpretation, or misinterpretation, of a foreign custom. The Athenians, after all, loved a good narrative, especially one where they, the clever city of democracy and reason, triumphed over the strange islanders with their bulls and their rituals. It is history retold by victors, dressed in myth. But whatever the truth, the story has endured. The image remains. A beast in a maze. And the maze? Oh, the maze is the most important part. Because it's not just a building. It's a metaphor. The labyrinth is the mind. The past. The trap of guilt. The structure we build to contain what we don't want to face. And the Minotaur. He's what we've placed at the centre. A fear. A memory. A mistake. Something we would rather forget. And so we wall it in. But it never goes away. It waits. Walk far enough into yourself, and you'll find it. And then, if you're very lucky, or very brave, or very foolish, you'll find the thread. And come out again. Theseus did. He left the labyrinth, but not without cost. He abandoned Ariadne on an island. Reasons vary. Some say he was ungrateful. Others say Dionysus claimed her. But the result was the same. Betrayal. He returned home. Forgot to change the sails from black to white, as he'd promised. His father, watching the ship from the cliffs of Athens, saw the dark sails and believed his son dead. In grief, he threw himself into the sea. And so the Aegean was named. Even victory in Greek myth comes with mourning. The Minotaur is dead, the labyrinth is empty. But somehow the story still echoes. We still build mazes. We still lock things away. And deep inside, the part of us that once heard the story as a child, that part still walks the halls, wondering what waits around the corner. So let's leave the torchlight behind. Let the corridors fall silent. The thread has been followed. The monster has been faced. You are no longer in the dark. You are no longer in the maze. You are back, here, where it is warm and still, where the Minotaur cannot find you, where the walls are no longer closing in, where sleep is waiting, gentle and slow. And whatever monster you face, it is not tonight. Let the labyrinth vanish. Let the hooves fall silent and rest. You've already walked far enough. It is night again, the kind of night where the wind hushes the trees into stillness, and the moon casts pale silver through the window like a watchful eye. You are still, and all is quiet. But long ago, in the world of myth, the wind was not always so gentle. There were times when it came shrieking across the sea, tearing sails from masts, snatching food from tables, stealing men from the decks of ships, and sometimes from the very skies. And if you were ancient Greek, and you heard that wind howling through the cliffs, you didn't just call it a storm. You might have whispered harpies. Or, if your conscience was not clean, if you'd wronged the gods or shed innocent blood, you might fear something worse, the Furies. Tonight, we drift into their stories, into winged warnings and shrieking skies, into judgment that flies, and punishment that never sleeps. We begin with the Harpies. Their name comes from the Greek harpazo, meaning to snatch, which is exactly what they do. Snatch, take, steal. They were not always evil, not precisely. In the earliest myths, they were storm spirits, daughters of the sea god Thaumas and the oceanid Electra. Their names were Aelo, Ocypete, and sometimes Kaleno. Lovely names, really. Storm, Swift Flyer, and the Dark One. At first, they were merely elemental, fierce winds given form. They raced through the air, screeching across the sea like a bad omen. Sometimes they helped carry souls. Sometimes they stole objects from the hands of mortals. They were fast, unpredictable, and always hungry. But over time, as stories grew darker, the Harpies became less abstract and more terrifying, less weather and more wrath. They were imagined as women with the bodies of great birds, vast wingspans, talons sharper than knives, and faces that once might have been beautiful, but had long since been twisted by rage and divine duty. Their scent was said to be foul, rot and smoke and salt. Their voices screeched like rusted hinges. Their feathers were streaked with filth, tangled with the remnants of whatever they had taken last. The harpies didn't hunt because they needed to eat. They hunted because someone had to. Because the gods, in their infinite wisdom, sometimes needed messengers who could make mortals miserable and fast. One of the most well-known tales involving them is the tragedy of King Phineus of Thrace. Phineus had a gift, the power of prophecy, but he made the mistake of revealing too much truth. He spoke freely of the gods' secrets, lifting the veil between divine will and human consequence. And for this he was punished, not with blindness, not with death, but with hunger. Each day a feast would be laid before him, meats roasted to perfection, fruits ripe and bursting, bread still warm. But as soon as he reached for a morsel, they came, the harpies. They descended in a fury of wings and claws, screaming and cackling. They would snatch the food away or foul it with filth so vile that even touching it was impossible. Phineus starved day after day, surrounded by an abundance he could not touch. He aged, grew gaunt, and wept, not from hunger alone, but from the cruelty of being so near to relief, and yet forever denied. Eventually help arrived, in the form of the Argonauts, those bold sailors on their quest for the Golden Fleece. Among them were Zetes and Calais, the Boreads, sons of the North Wind. They had wings of their own, feathered limbs that shimmered with speed. When the harpies next came for Phineus's feast, Zetes and Calais gave chase. The sky filled with feathers, steel, and shrieks. The harpies fled westward, beaten and breathless, until the goddess Iris, messenger of the gods, appeared. She struck a bargain. The harpies would leave Phineus in peace, and in return their lives would be spared. They vanished into the farthest reaches of the world. Some said they made their home near the Elysian wind, far from man, but never truly gone. They lingered in myth, always hungry, always watching. Some said they stole children. Others believed they carried away the souls of the guilty. Others still believed that they were divine instruments of pestilence, bringers of plague. And perhaps they were all these things, in one form or another. Because the harpies don't just represent theft, they represent torment. Unrelenting, unjust torment. That shadow of cruelty that sometimes hangs over those who are already suffering. They take what cannot be taken again. But the Furies are not thieves. They are not mischief makers or shrieking winds. They are judges. They are punishment given wings, older than gods, born of blood. Their origin is a tale soaked in myth, and myth alone. When Uranus, the sky god, was overthrown by his son Kronos, his blood fell to the earth. And from that earth, Gaia, mother of all, rose the Erinyes, the Furies, Alecto, Megaera, Tisiphone. They were not created, they emerged. Primeval forces, not evil, not good, but necessary. Alecto punished moral crimes. Megaera, jealousy and vengeance. Tisiphone, murder, especially within families. They did not come uninvited, but once summoned, they never stopped. The Furies are always female, but not in the gentle way mortals often imagined femininity. They are motherhood without mercy, memory without forgiveness, the part of justice that does not weep, but endures. Their hair was coiled with serpents. Their breath burned. They carried torches, scourges, and poisonous snakes. Sometimes their robes bled. Sometimes their very footsteps caused madness. Their presence brought guilt alive. Their pursuit made the mind their hunting ground. They didn't just punish you. They made you punish yourself. No crime summoned them faster than kinslaying, particularly the murder of a parent by a child. And so we return to Orestes, the son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra. Agamemnon, who sailed to Troy, who sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia to win the winds, who returned years later only to be murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra, and her lover. And Orestes? He was told that justice demanded he avenge his father, and he did. He killed his mother. And the moment her blood hit the floor, the Furies rose. They came screaming from the cracks in the earth, not with swords, but with questions. They asked not whether Orestes was brave, but whether he was right. He fled to Delphi, to Apollo, to Athens, but they followed, into temples, into dreams, into madness. The first trial in history was held to decide his fate, not by mortals, but by gods. Athena herself cast the deciding vote, choosing mercy. Orestes was freed, but the Furies were not banished. Athena offered them a new role, not as tormentors, but as guardians of justice. She gave them a home beneath Athens, in the sacred grove of the Areopagus. There they would reside, watching over oaths, hearing the cries of the wronged. And they accepted. They became the Eumenides, the kindly ones. It was not a euphemism. It was transformation. Because even vengeance can grow tired of blood. Even fury can find peace. They still appeared, of course, in stories, in dreams, in guilt that wouldn't fade. But they had become part of justice, not its enemy. In this, the Greeks showed a profound truth. That justice is not only about punishment, it is about memory. The Furies remember. They remember what the world tries to forget. The girl silenced, the child abandoned, the murder unpunished, the lie that became law. And they wait, because time, for them, does not move as it does for mortals. They do not age, they do not sleep, they watch. And when the world turns too far from balance, they rise. In art they are sometimes softened, made into older women, stern but wise. But in the oldest depictions, they are fire in the shape of women. They are nightmares made noble, and they never blink. Harpies are hunger. Furies are conscience. Harpies are storm. Furies are structure. Both fly, both frighten. But the Harpies take what is yours. The Furies make you face what you've done. And that is perhaps more terrifying. Because monsters, as we often say, are not always outside the house. Sometimes they are inside. Sometimes they wear your name. Sometimes they sound like your own thoughts. But the Furies don't arrive to harm. They arrive to remind, to weigh, to make sure you know, deep down, quietly, just before sleep, that justice is not blind. It only waits. But tonight, there is no cause for fear. The Harpies have flown far from your windows. The Furies are not coming, unless you've summoned them. And you haven't. You are still. You are safe. You are drifting. And they are only stories, old and winged and watching, but not for you. Not tonight. Let the feathers settle. Let the torches dim. Let sleep take you softly. The kindly ones are at rest. And so are you. The night is quiet now. The kind of quiet that lives in the space between thoughts. The kind that feels like a question waiting to be asked. And that's fitting. Because tonight we meet the monster who waits with questions. Not with claws, not with fire, but with a riddle and a smile, a stillness, a choice. This is the story of the Sphinx. Not the Egyptian one, that grand, silent guardian of sand and sun. Number the Greek Sphinx is something else entirely. Not a monument, but a challenge. Part lion, part woman, part bird, and all mystery. She sits outside the city of Thebes, on a rock just high enough to see the road, just low enough to be seen. Her wings are tucked in, her gaze unblinking. She does not chase. She does not move. She waits. And when someone passes, she speaks. One question, answer correctly, and she lets you go. Answer wrong, she devours you. But let's begin not with her end, but her origin, which, like many things in Greek mythology, is half divine, half uncertain. The Sphinx was said to be the daughter of two monstrous parents, Orpheus, the two-headed hound, and the Chimera, herself a creature stitched from lion, goat and serpent. Others say she was born of Echidna and Typhon, the same pair who spawned so many of the terrors we've met on this journey. But while her siblings raged and clawed and burned, the Sphinx was given a quieter weapon, intellect. She was sent, some say by the gods, others say by fate, to punish the city of Thebes. Hera may have sent her, angry over an old insult, or Hades, in need of balance, or perhaps it was simply the gods being gods, petty, patient, and fond of difficult lessons. Either way, the Sphinx appeared. She took her place outside the gates of Thebes, and there she stayed. She didn't destroy the city. She didn't demand a tribute. She didn't scream or threaten. She asked a riddle. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 in the evening? No hints, no elaboration. Those who tried to pass her without answering, or who answered poorly, were caught in her claws and torn apart. Not out of malice, simply because that was the price of failure. Thebes was paralysed. Trade slowed. Travellers vanished. The field went untilled. The people cowered behind their walls. Their future held hostage by a single sentence. Not a dragon, not a war. A question. And that's what made the Sphinx terrifying. She didn't punish through brute force. She punished through uncertainty. Her victims were not the weak. They were the unprepared. To face her was to gamble with your understanding of the world, to risk not just your life, but your certainty. And so, the question remained, waiting. Until one day, a man arrived. Oedipus. His name echoes through time, known now for the strange tragedy of his fate. But on this day, he was still only a traveller, weary, clever, and already marked by prophecy. He had left his home in Corinth behind, believing he could outrun a curse, that he would kill his father and marry his mother. And in trying to escape that fate, he walked straight into it. But not yet, for now he was just a man on the road to Thebes. And on that road he met her, the Sphinx. Her eyes fixed on him. He did not flinch. She asked her riddle, and he answered. Man, in childhood he crawls on 4 legs. In adulthood he walks upright on 2. And in old age he walks with a cane, as with 3. The answer was simple. Obvious, perhaps. Once you heard it. But no one else had. No one else had looked at the riddle and seen not a trick, but a truth. That life itself is a riddle. That time shapes us. That we change, not just in form, but in need. Oedipus understood the riddle not as a puzzle, but as a pattern. And with that answer, the Sphinx was undone. She didn't curse. She didn't cry. She simply leapt from her rock and fell. Her body dashed against the cliffs, her wings snapping, her silence sealed. Why? Some say she was bound by magic, that once her riddle was answered, her purpose was spent. Others say she died of shame, unable to bear defeat. But perhaps she chose to go, because a riddle once solved is no longer sacred. A mystery once unravelled cannot remain a monster. And she was never really a beast, she was a question. And now she was done. Thebes rejoiced. Oedipus was hailed as a hero, married the queen, and became king. But you know, or perhaps remember, that this was not a happy ending. Because the man he killed at the crossroads, his father, and the queen he married, his mother. The riddle he solved was only the first. The harder one, the one about who he truly was, would take much longer to answer, and cost him everything. But that is another story. Let's linger here just for now, with the Sphinx. Because she's more than a monster. She is the moment before understanding. She is the stillness before speech. She is the test that cannot be passed by strength, only by reflection. The Sphinx is what waits when you stop running, when you're alone, when a question rises inside you that no one else can answer. She is not an enemy. She is a gate, and every one of us must pass her. Sometimes once, sometimes again and again. In art she appears regal and restrained, lioness body curved in repose, wings arched like thoughts on the verge of flight. Her eyes distant, not cruel, not even curious, just waiting. In the most famous depiction, a verse from the 5th century BCE, she sits on a pillar. Oedipus stands below thinking. That's all. No drama, no violence. Just a question, and a man trying to find the shape of its answer. The Greeks didn't draw her with fire or gore. They didn't need to. Because the Sphinx is terrifying not for what she does, but for what she requires. She requires you to know yourself. And there's no weapon for that, only thought. Even now she waits in our stories, in classrooms, in crossroads, in quiet moments before dawn. She lives wherever a question is asked that might change you. And she doesn't threaten, she challenges. There is something oddly comforting in that. All the monsters we've met so far, they lash, they howl, they hunger. The Sphinx? She only asks. And sometimes what she offers, that moment of understanding, is worth the risk. Because knowledge, like all sacred things, must be earned. And what we learn in silence often stays with us longer than what we learn in fire. So if you ever find yourself standing before her, not in a myth, but in a moment, don't panic. Breathe. Think. The answer may not come right away. It may feel impossible, but it is there, and she will wait. Not kindly, perhaps, but patiently, because that is what the Sphinx does. She waits for us to grow into our answers. And now she is gone. Her cliff is empty, her wings folded for good. And you, dear listener, have passed. You have walked the road, faced the riddle, spoken the words, and now you may rest. Close your eyes. The question has been asked, the answer given. The monster has stepped aside, and the gates have opened. Let us begin, not with thunder or prophecy, but with a girl and her loom. She was called Arachne, a mortal with hands so deft they moved like wind through wool. Her tapestries shimmered with colour and precision, scenes so finely woven they seemed to breathe. People said she must have learned from Athena herself, which was the sort of praise one should never utter too loudly in ancient Greece. Arachne didn't deny it. In fact, she laughed. She said she was better. And that, you see, was a mistake. For the gods of Olympus were not distant, noble deities. They were near, always near. and they didn't particularly like being compared to mortals, let alone outdone by them. So Athena came down from the heavens, her pride pricked like a burr under the skin, and challenged the girl to a contest. 2 looms, 2 minds, 1 divine, 1 human. And Arachne's tapestry? It was exquisite, a panorama of the gods' misdeeds. Zeus seducing women in a dozen disguises, Poseidon ravishing Medusa in Athena's temple, Apollo chasing nymphs who wanted nothing to do with him. The thread glittered with uncomfortable truth. Athena's work, by contrast, was flawless and stern, a depiction of piety and punishment. But when she saw Arachne's piece, she flew into a rage, not because it was wrong, but because it wasn't. She tore it apart and struck the girl down. Then, in that strangely poetic cruelty the gods so loved, transformed her into a spider. And so Arachne still weaves, but without fingers, without pride, without a voice. A cautionary tale, and one that sets the tone. Because in Greek mythology, if a god notices you, it rarely ends well. The Olympians, you see, were not above meddling. They did not dwell on high with benevolent detachment. Number. They peered down, eyes sharp as hawks, looking for beauty, arrogance, wit, or defiance. Anything that might amuse or annoy them. Humans were their toys, their distractions, their cautionary examples. Take Semele, a mortal woman beloved of Zeus. He whispered sweet nothings into her ear and promised her anything she wished, and in a moment of fatal honesty she asked to see him as he truly was, in all his divine radiance. Zeus warned her. He begged her to reconsider, but an oath was an oath, and when he revealed his true form, the brightness alone consumed her, burned to ash. Their unborn child, Dionysus, was saved only because Zeus sewed him into his own thigh, like a strange botanical graft. He was born later, with a head full of vines and madness. Another mortal, Io, suffered a different fate. She caught Zeus's eye, an unfortunate habit of many young women in mythology. To conceal her from Hera, Zeus turned her into a cow. A lovely cow, to be fair, but still. Hera, never one to be fooled for long, demanded the cow as a gift, and assigned Argus, a giant with 100 eyes, to guard her. And so Io wandered, watched always, pursued by a gadfly Hera sent to torment her. She crossed continents, became a legend. Eventually she was restored to human form, but not before learning that divine attention was a form of punishment in itself. Even mortals who never sought glory often found themselves dragged into the gods' schemes. Cassandra was one such soul. She was given the gift of prophecy by Apollo in exchange for her love. But when she changed her mind, as people do, Apollo did not take rejection well. He cursed her. She would still speak true prophecies, but no one would ever believe her. She saw the fall of Troy. She saw her own death. She saw fire and ruin, and no one listened, not once. The Greeks had a word for this kind of tragic arrogance, hubris. It wasn't just pride, it was overstepping. Crossing invisible lines drawn by gods who did not like their creations to become too clever, too bold, or too beautiful. Mortals who rose too high were always brought low. Not always with death, but sometimes with something worse. Take Niobe, Queen of Thebes. She had many children, 12 in some stories, 14 in others, and she made the mistake of bragging that she was more deserving of worship than Leto, who had only 2. Unfortunately for Niobe, Leto's 2 children were Artemis and Apollo. They descended like arrows from the sky. One by one, Niobe's children fell. She wept and screamed and begged. In the end, the gods turned her to stone. a weeping rock carved by grief. And somewhere in Anatolia, the stone still stands. Mortals could rarely win, and when they did, it often came with strings attached, like poor Typhon, who demanded proof that the sun god Helios was his father. Helios, bound by paternal pride and perhaps a touch of guilt, allowed him to drive the chariot of the sun for a day. A teenage boy, at the reins of a flaming, sky-burning, day-dragging chariot. It did not go well. He lost control. The sun veered too close to the earth. Fields scorched, rivers boiled, the world began to unravel. Zeus, ever the cosmic janitor, hurled a lightning bolt and ended it. Typhon fell like a star and crashed into the river Eridanus. Mortals grieved, the gods moved on. Even the great wars of mortals were often started by divine pettiness. The Trojan War, for instance, did not begin with ships or sieges. It began with a golden apple. Eris, goddess of discord, wasn't invited to a divine wedding. So she did what any resentful guest might. She tossed a golden apple into the feast, inscribed with the words, "To the fairest." Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite all reached for it. They demanded a judge. And they found one in Paris, a Trojan prince tending sheep far from the noise of court. Each goddess offered him a gift. Hera offered power. Athena offered wisdom and victory in battle. Aphrodite offered the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. He chose beauty. He chose Aphrodite. And that woman, Helen, was already married to a Spartan king. When Paris took her to Troy, the world ignited. 1,000 ships launched. Heroes died, cities burned. All because of one mortal asked to judge a divine beauty pageant. It should be said, no good ever came of mortals trying to decide which god was better. The gods didn't want truth. They wanted flattery. But mortals could not avoid them. Not really. They prayed. They sacrificed. They lit fires and poured wine and whispered names before sleep. The temples were many, and the gods were everywhere, not always listening, but always present. And the relationship was not about love. It was about survival. To be immortal was to walk carefully, to give thanks quickly, to take no credit, even for your own genius, to hope, above all, to be overlooked. Because to be noticed by the gods was to become a story. And in Greek mythology, stories rarely ended well. The gods did not weep for mortals, they used them. Sometimes they gave gifts, yes. A golden touch here, a prophecy there. But the gifts often turned sour. Midas wished for everything he touched to turn to gold. And soon he could touch nothing. Not bread, not water, not his daughter. He begged for the gift to be taken back. It was. But not before he learned that divine generosity always has a price. Some mortals tried to outwit fate, but fate was older than the gods. The Moirai, the Fates, spun, measured, and cut the threads of life. Even Zeus could not undo what they wove. Oedipus tried. Told he would kill his father and marry his mother, he fled the home he knew. And in doing so, he fulfilled the prophecy. The very effort to escape his doom brought it into being. That was the cruel beauty of Greek myth. No one was above fate, not kings, not queens, not heroes, and certainly not mortals. So why, one might wonder, did people keep believing in these gods? Why pray to deities who punished more than protected? Because the gods explained the world. The storms, the floods, the sudden illnesses, the way fortunes rose and fell. All of it could be seen in the stories. The gods gave shape to chaos. They made meaning from suffering. They were not just punishers. They were metaphors, archetypes, warnings in flesh, and for all their flaws, they were unforgettable. To be immortal in Greek mythology was to be temporary, a momentary flash of joy or error, a name in a line of verse, a thread in the great tapestry of fate, sometimes brilliant, often blood-stained, always fragile. And somewhere above or beyond, the gods watched, amused, displeased, or merely curious. And you, little mortal, you simply did your best to survive the story. It's one thing to make a mistake and suffer for it, but imagine being doomed not because of what you did, but because of what your great-great-grandfather once said to a god, possibly while drunk, and possibly while losing at dice. In the world of Greek mythology, curses were not simply misfortunes. They were legacy items. Heirlooms passed down with the family name. You could inherit your father's nose, your mother's eyes, and a divine malediction that would ruin your entire bloodline for generations. It made for a dramatic family tree, heavy on nobility, light on happy endings. Consider, for example, the House of Atreus, a dynasty so steeped in doom that it makes the average soap opera look like a church picnic. The trouble began, as it so often does, with a quarrel between brothers. Atreus and Thyestes, sons of Pelops, squabbled over the Mycenaean throne. There was betrayal, adultery, and then, inevitably, cannibalism. Atreus, having discovered that his brother had an affair with his wife, decided the appropriate response was to serve him a feast of his own children, artfully roasted. Now, you might assume the gods would intervene here. Smite someone. Send a memo. But no. The gods simply nodded grimly and let the curse settle in like a stain. From that moment on, the family was doomed. Atreus' son Agamemnon went on to become the commander of the Greek forces in the Trojan War, a great honour. He also sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia to get a favourable wind, spent 10 years at war, and was murdered in his bath upon returning home by his wife, Clytemnestra, and her lover. His surviving children then had to decide whether avenging their father was more important than not murdering their mother. A difficult position, even by mythological standards. Orestes, the son, chose vengeance. He killed Clytemnestra, and was promptly hounded across the land by the Furies, ancient goddesses of vengeance, with snakes for hair and a passion for justice that did not forgive matricide. Only with divine intervention and a trial at the Areopagus in Athens was Orestes finally acquitted. But even then, the stain lingered. The House of Atreus was the cautionary tale of cautionary tales. A bloodline cursed with betrayal, madness, and murder, not because each generation was evil, but because the weight of divine wrath could not be shaken off like old dust. And it wasn't just royal families who suffered this fate. Take Oedipus, poor, unfortunate Oedipus, born to Laius and Jocasta, king and queen of Thebes. Laius, like many mythical men, made a mistake. He abducted a young man, violating hospitality and sacred law. The gods frowned upon this, and a curse was laid. The prophecy came, their child would kill his father and marry his mother. Naturally, they did what any responsible parents might do. They tried to have the baby killed. But the servant they tasked with the job couldn't quite bring himself to do it. He left the child to die on a hillside instead. A shepherd found him. The boy was raised in Corinth, unaware of his origins. Years later, Oedipus, now a young man, heard a whisper of prophecy himself, that he would kill his father and marry his mother. Horrified, he fled Corinth, trying to outrun destiny. But you can't outpace the fates. He met Laius on the road. There was an argument, as ancient fathers and sons are wont to have. A fight broke out. One man died. Later, Oedipus married Jocasta, queen of Thebes, and had children. The truth came slowly, horribly. Jocasta hanged herself. Oedipus blinded himself. And their children, Antigone and her siblings, would inherit not just a ruined throne, but a family history thick with sorrow. Greek tragedy, you see, doesn't bother with happy endings. It begins with the seed of ruin and watches it grow. This idea that a family line could be cursed wasn't just poetic fiction. The Greeks believed in something called miasma, a kind of spiritual pollution. It could be inherited. You could be born unclean because of the sins of your ancestors. Blood cries out for more blood, and until the cycle is broken, through sacrifice, exile, or divine mercy, it continues. We might see it as metaphor today. Generational trauma, the sins of the father. But for the Greeks, it was very literal. A spiritual rot that clung to a name, not unlike mildew on stone. You could change your clothes, your city, even your gods, but the curse remained. And so we find mortals who live in fear, not of what they might do, but what they are, who they are. Perseus, hero and slayer of Medusa, was himself born of questionable circumstance. His mother, Danae, was locked in a bronze chamber by her father, who had heard a prophecy that her child would kill him. Zeus, never one to let bronze get in the way of romance, visited her in the form of golden rain, one of the stranger seduction tactics in myth. Danae conceived. Perseus was born. The king, aghast, did not kill the child, but set mother and son adrift at sea. They survived. Perseus thrived. Years later he returned and, entirely by accident, struck his grandfather dead with a discus at some friendly games. Fate fulfilled. Even when no one meant any harm, prophecy finds its loopholes. These stories reflect something deep in the Greek psyche. The idea that fate is not something you can bargain with. It is a web already woven, and every step you take simply tangles you further. Mortals tried to be clever. They tried to outthink destiny, but the gods always smiled quietly and let them try. Sometimes the curse was physical. The line of Cadmus, founder of Thebes, was riddled with misfortune. His descendants included Pentheus, torn apart by his own mother in a frenzy of Dionysian madness, and Actaeon, who accidentally saw Artemis bathing and was transformed into a stag, then hunted and killed by his own hounds. Cadmus himself, after a life of toil and tragedy, was turned into a serpent. His wife too. They slithered off into obscurity, perhaps the kindest ending in that entire family history. But not all cursed families were royal. Some were simply too beautiful for their own good. Take the tale of Phaedra, wife of Theseus. Her stepson, Hippolytus, was a devout follower of Artemis. So devout, in fact, that he shunned all love and scorned Aphrodite. And you can imagine how well that went. Aphrodite, goddess of love and vengeance, arranged for Phaedra to fall in love with him. It was unnatural, tragic. When he rejected her, she took her own life and left a note claiming he had attacked her. Theseus cursed his son, and Poseidon, never one to pass up a smiting, obliged. Hippolytus died, dashed against the rocks by his own chariot horses. You could die because your family was cursed, or because a god wanted revenge on someone you reminded them of, or simply because you existed in the orbit of doomed people. Misery was contagious. The Greeks didn't believe in fairness, not in the modern sense. They believed in Moira, one's share, one's portion of fate. Some were given great glory, others were given ruin, sometimes both. But what about redemption, you might ask? What about mortals who escaped the curse? They're rare, but not impossible. Orestes, hounded by the Furies, eventually received a trial in Athens. The jury was split, half for acquittal, half for condemnation. Athena herself cast the deciding vote, not in the name of justice but mercy. And in that moment, a new idea emerged, that law might one day replace vengeance, that perhaps a man need not be defined solely by his ancestors' crimes. It was a glimmer of hope, a small one. But there it was. In the meantime, the average mortal lived quietly, married carefully, prayed constantly, one eye on the gods, one foot in the dirt, hoping the sins of the father had not already taken root in the son. To be a mortal in Greek mythology was to live in a story that began long before you were born, and might not end until long after you were gone. Your life was a single verse in a tragic poem, shaped by bloodlines, curses, and the unpredictable whims of fate. You might rise, you might fall, but you would not escape the weight of your name. And if the gods whispered your family's name in Olympus, whether in praise or in jest, that was rarely a good sign. There are many lessons to learn from Greek mythology, but one stands above the rest, carved like a warning into the very foundations of Mount Olympus. Do not talk back to the gods. Don't question them. Don't correct them. Don't get clever, sarcastic, or poetic. Don't mutter under your breath. Don't sigh too loudly. And above all, do not, under any circumstances, try to win an argument, because they will hear you. They always do. And while gods may be immortal, their egos are surprisingly brittle. Take the case of Pentheus, king of Thebes, young, proud, fond of order. He ruled with a sharp eye and a firm hand. And then Dionysus arrived. Now, Dionysus was not your typical Olympian. Born of a mortal mother, Semele, and carried in Zeus's thigh, he straddled the line between divine and human, wild and civilized, wine and wrath. His worship was strange, ecstatic, dancing in the woods, drinking, shouting, shedding inhibition like a snakeskin. Pentheus, unimpressed, declared it nonsense. He banned Dionysian rites, arrested the god in disguise, mocked his long hair, and in the sort of fatal decision only a tragic character could make, decided to spy on the Bacchic women in their revels, dressed as one of them. He crept into the forest in a flowing gown, perched in a tree for a better view, and there, in the moonlight, the women saw him. But they did not see a man. Dionysus clouded their minds. They saw a lion. They attacked. His own mother, Agave, was first to reach him. She tore him down. He died in pieces, smiling up at the stars. The gods are nothing if not theatrical. Pentheus's crime? He laughed. He doubted. He told the gods they were nonsense. And the gods, it turns out, have a very clear opinion on nonsense. Another fellow who learned this the hard way was Capaneus, a warrior in the myth of the Seven against Thebes. He scaled the city walls, bold as brass, and declared aloud, in the middle of battle, that not even Zeus could stop him. Zeus did stop him, with a lightning bolt, instant death, crisped mid-sentence. There's a curious silence that follows stories like these, a kind of collective holding of breath, because the moral is never subtle. Speak out of turn, and you will be turned to ash, or stone, or mist, or a cautionary statue in some temple courtyard. Even those who told the truth, Not lies, but inconvenient truths were punished. Cassandra, Princess of Troy, was given the gift of prophecy by Apollo. But when she rejected his advances, or rather accepted the gift and then rejected him, he cursed her. She would still see the future, yes. She would see it clearly, brilliantly, unbearably, but no one would ever believe her. She warned of the Trojan horse, of the sack of the city, of her own death, and every word fell like dust. Disbelieved, ignored, dismissed. The gods, you see, don't mind if you're right, as long as it's flattering. If it's not, well, you'll find yourself yelling into the void. And sometimes the punishment came not from the god directly, but through the very forces of fate itself. Take Arachne. You'll remember her from earlier. The weaver who dared claim she was better than Athena. The detail often overlooked in her story is this. She was right. Her tapestry was beautiful. It told the truth. It depicted the gods' crimes, their disguises, their seductions. And Athena, though furious, could not deny the skill. So she destroyed the work. And the girl. Because it is not enough to be right. You must also be reverent. And in ancient Greece, reverence did not mean quiet belief. It meant submission. It's easy to judge the gods as petty. And to be fair, they often were. But their responses reflect something deeper about the way the Greeks saw the world. The gods were not moral exemplars. They were not just or fair in the way we use those terms now. They were powerful, and that, in the ancient world, was the only justice that mattered. Power could not be questioned without consequence. The gods represented not ideals, but forces. The sea was Poseidon, stormy, unpredictable, capable of bounty or destruction. Wisdom was Athena, cold, strategic, sometimes cruel. Love was Aphrodite, capricious, overwhelming, delightfully irrational. To insult a god was to insult the very fabric of the world. To question Artemis was to court death in childbirth. To laugh at Demeter was to risk famine. And the gods did not need to punish you personally. Sometimes they let your own words do the damage. Consider Niobe again, the queen who bragged about her many children, mocking Leto for having only 2. It was not just pride, it was speech. She voiced disrespect. She put it into the world. And so Leto's children, Apollo and Artemis, struck her family down, one by one. When the last child died, Niobe fled to a mountain top and begged the gods to end her suffering. They granted her request, turned her to stone. Even her tears, they say, became part of the mountain, always weeping, never changing. It's tempting to imagine these stories as metaphors, cautionary tales for courtly behaviour. But in ancient Greece, they were lived truths. Not literal, perhaps, but deeply embedded in ritual and thought. People didn't just fear the gods, they feared saying the wrong thing near a shrine, making a joke during a sacrifice, yawning too loudly during a festival. Speech was power, and power could summon attention. And attention, divine attention, was rarely a blessing. The Greek term for this was asebeia, impiety. It didn't mean heresy in the modern sense. It meant acting improperly toward the divine, speaking out of turn, behaving without the right reverence. Socrates, the philosopher, was executed not for atheism, but for asebeia, corrupting the youth, introducing new gods, and failing to honour the old ones. The gods did not require you to love them, but they demanded respect. The curious thing is, the gods themselves rarely held to the same standard. Zeus was a serial adulterer. Hera was vengeful beyond reason. Poseidon flooded cities in fits of pique. Apollo flayed a man alive for losing a music contest. And yet, to question their actions was to invite ruin. It was a divine paradox. You were expected to worship beings whose flaws were legendary. And you had to do it with sincerity. And so, the average mortal developed a very pragmatic relationship with religion. You honoured the gods because it was safer that way. You made offerings. You said your prayers. You did not boast. You did not challenge. And if the gods smiled on you, wonderful. And if they didn't, you assumed you'd offended them somehow and tried harder. There's a quiet desperation in that, a sort of cosmic appeasement, a reminder that in a world ruled by immortals with bad tempers, the only real power mortals had was silence. Which brings us to another kind of punishment, not dramatic, not fiery, not sudden, but slow, oblivion. The Greeks believed in kleos, glory the kind that lives on in stories. But if you defied the gods in some quiet, unseen way, you might not be struck down. You might simply be forgotten. No songs, no statues, no name carved into stone. To be remembered was its own kind of immortality. To be erased was the cruelest fate of all. That, perhaps, is why so many Greek mortals died dramatically. They weren't just unlucky, they were memorable. To live quietly was safe, but it meant no glory, no legacy. And so mortals danced along a razor's edge, seeking renown but fearing offence, wanting to be known but not cursed, wanting most of all to speak their truth without being struck by lightning. But the gods were always listening, even when they pretended not to be, especially then. And so, dear listener, if you ever find yourself wandering the paths of ancient Greece, under a fig tree or beside a bubbling spring, and you feel tempted to complain aloud about your lot in life, perhaps wait until you're well out of earshot, because one of them might be listening, and one of them might be bored. And mortals who talk back tend not to talk long. You're walking along a dusty road. There's a cool breeze, the scent of thyme and olive in the air, and the sound of distant goats. All is calm. All is ordinary. And then, suddenly, a creature the size of a house steps out from behind a rock and decides you look like lunch. Welcome to a fairly typical Tuesday in ancient Greek mythology. For mortals, the world was never just fields and sky. It was also lairs. Caves, cliffs, forests thick with teeth and scales. You never quite knew what might be lurking behind the next olive tree. A shepherd, a satyr, or a three-headed dog. The Greeks were particularly fond of monsters. Not in the way modern stories might treat them. Misunderstood, sympathetic, tragic. No, their monsters were, generally speaking, quite content being horrible. They didn't need complex motivations, they just needed appetites. And unfortunately, mortals were often the preferred dish. Let us begin with one of the greats, the Chimera. Not just one beast, but three. A lion in the front, a goat sprouting from its back, and a snake for a tail. It breathed fire, of course, because why not? Its purpose in life appeared to be to roam the countryside, burning livestock and incinerating anyone with a torch and a sword who thought they might make a name for themselves. Heroic, yes, but also flammable. Then there's Scylla. Poor sailors. They thought the worst part of their journey was the open sea, the storms, the pirates, the hunger. But then they reached the straits, narrow and perilous. On one side, a whirlpool named Charybdis, which could suck down entire ships like a drunkard draining a wineskin. And on the other, Scylla, a rock-dwelling horror with 12 legs, 6 heads, and a fondness for plucking sailors off decks like hors d'oeuvres. There was no safe route. If you steered away from one, you veered too close to the other. And in life, as in myth, some choices are not about winning. They're about minimizing how much of your crew you lose. Or take the Minotaur. Half man, half bull. Raised in a labyrinth so complex that even its builder barely escaped. This monster was the result of a long and unfortunate chain of divine meddling and royal bad judgment. A queen enchanted to fall in love with a bull, an architect with too much imagination, and a child born of that union, imprisoned forever in darkness. The Athenians, having displeased King Minos of Crete, were forced to send 7 young men and 7 maidens every 9 years as tribute, to be released into the labyrinth. None returned. Until, of course, Theseus came along with his ball of string and healthy levels of self-confidence. But for decades before that, the Minotaur simply ate. That was the thing about monsters in Greek mythology. They weren't just dangers, they were reminders, symbols, warnings perhaps, that the world wasn't made for human comfort. That out there, in the deep places, the gods had let chaos roam free. And mortals? Mortals were often the price paid for order. The Sphinx, perched outside Thebes, was another such price. She asked riddles. If you answered incorrectly, she killed you. For weeks, months, perhaps even years, travellers passed, tried, failed, died. Until Oedipus, clever, doomed Oedipus, came along and answered her question correctly. The Sphinx leapt from her perch and perished, which sounds like a victory. Until you remember that this was only the beginning of Oedipus's troubles. Solving one monster's riddle only led him deeper into the riddle of his own blood. These creatures weren't all created equal either. Some were born of primordial forces, like Typhon, a storm demon so massive and terrible that the gods themselves fled Olympus when he rose. Others were spawned by Echidna, the mother of all monsters, who seemed to have a very productive relationship with Typhon, birthing Hydra, Cerberus, and a host of other delightful creatures best admired from a distance. Hydra, for instance, was a serpent with multiple heads. When you cut one off, 2 more grew in its place. A handy metaphor, really, for problems that get worse the more you meddle. Or, in the case of Heracles, just another day's work. Heracles, the closest thing Greek mythology has to a full-time monster exterminator, spent his life dealing with the gods' unfinished business. Giant boars, man-eating birds, hellhounds, all sent his way, usually as part of a labour assigned by a cowardly king or an angry god. One gets the sense that the Olympians didn't like clearing up their messes. They just created monsters, then waited for some sweaty mortal with a club to solve the problem. And when he did, they might grant him a wreath, or more likely, send him another one. Even beautiful creatures could be deadly. The sirens, for instance, sat on craggy rocks by the sea, singing songs so sweet that sailors forgot themselves. Forgot food, sleep, wives, children, everything. They steered toward the sound, dashed their ships on the rocks, and died smiling. Odysseus, clever man that he was, stuffed his crew's ears with wax and tied himself to the mast just to hear their song without being lured. A rare case of a man encountering a monster and surviving with his life and ego intact. More often, mortals stumbled upon danger with no warning. A flash of feathers, a shadow in the sky, a hiss from a cave. The ancient Greek countryside in myth was riddled with hazards, not just beasts, but divine punishments given form. And yet, despite all this, monsters were necessary. They gave heroes something to fight. They shaped stories into arcs, from fear to confrontation to sometimes triumph. But for the ordinary mortal, the non-hero, the farmer or fisher or child caught in the crossfire, they were simply a reminder that the world was not safe. Imagine living in a time when no explanation existed for earthquakes or droughts, where disease had no clear cause, where lightning struck without warning. The world must have seemed full of unseen forces. And so the Greeks filled that uncertainty with teeth and wings and claws. But monsters were not just symbols of nature. They were also warnings about behaviour. Take Medusa. She began, in some versions, as a beautiful maiden. But after Poseidon assaulted her in Athena's temple, the goddess punished her, not Poseidon, by turning her into a gorgon, snake hair, petrifying gaze, solitude eternal. What was she really? A monster? Or a woman transformed by divine wrath into something others should fear? Perhaps both. The Greeks understood that monsters were not just born, they were made. Often they were mortals first, changed by curses, by jealousy, by vengeance. The line between human and beast was always thin. Lycaon, for example, was a king who served Zeus human flesh disguised as hospitality. In return, he was turned into a wolf. An early werewolf tale, if you like, but also a message: offend the gods, and you might lose more than your manners. Even lovers of gods could become monsters. Take Lamia, once a queen of Libya, beloved by Zeus. Hera, naturally, took offence. As punishment, Lamia's children were slain. Grief drove her mad. Hera then added a cruel twist. Lamia was cursed never to sleep and to devour the children of others. She became a night-stalking demon, feared in lullabies. But beneath the horror was sorrow. Her monstrousness was not her fault. It was her sentence. In this way, monsters in Greek myth were often tragic. Not in a soft, modern sense, but in the hard, classical sense of the word. They suffered, they frightened, they died, but they were never senseless. They meant something. Even Cerberus, the three-headed hound of Hades, had his purpose. He stood at the gates of the Underworld, let souls in, did not let them out. A monster, yes, but also a guardian, a cosmic border collie of sorts. And so mortals lived with monsters not just in story, but in worldview. They were the teeth in the darkness, the consequences of divine will, or human folly, or simply the old world not yet tamed. No mortal could kill them all. No city could be safe forever. But they endured. They built temples to gods who might keep monsters away. They passed down tales, how to defeat them, how to avoid them, how to live with knowledge that they might always be nearby. For some, monsters were an invitation, a chance to rise, to become a hero, to carve their name in the annals of myth. For others, they were just bad luck, a wrong turn, a scream in the night. And for most, they were simply a reminder that the world was not made for their comfort. It was a place of beauty, yes, but also of wings in the sky, scales beneath the waves, eyes in the dark. And when the gods were bored, or careless, or cruel, they let the monsters roam free. There's a strange thing about Greek heroes. They shine like stars in poetry, cast in bronze, immortalized in epic. Their names echo through the centuries: Achilles, Heracles, Jason, Odysseus. But if you pause a moment and really look at their stories, not the glory, but the lives themselves, you might begin to wonder, was it worth it? Because to be a hero in Greek mythology was to be famous, yes, but also to be hunted, cursed, betrayed, punished, exiled, tormented by the gods, and, without fail, to die tragically. You were heroic, but you were disposable. Let's begin with the most obvious case, Achilles, the poster boy of Greek heroism. Stronger than all, faster than most, and blessed or cursed with a choice. Live a long, quiet life in obscurity, or die young and gain eternal glory. Naturally, he chose the latter. This is Greek myth after all. Longevity was never fashionable. So he sailed for Troy, fought for 10 long years, killed Hector, dragged his body around the city walls, and then one morning was struck down by a single arrow, guided by Apollo, fired by Paris, and aimed at the one soft place on his body, the heel. It's poetic, of course, but also rather deflating. All that strength, all that wrath. And in the end, one tiny vulnerability was enough. Because heroes were never allowed to simply age. They didn't retire. They didn't settle down and write memoirs. They didn't even get to enjoy their triumphs. They existed to die at the right moment, in the right way, for the right song to be sung. And the gods made sure of it. Heracles, or Hercules, if you prefer the Latin form, is another fine example. A man so strong he held up the sky, cleaned the stables of Algaeus in a single afternoon, and strangled snakes in his cradle. But for all his power, he was never free. The 12 labours, those famous feats, were not optional. They were penance. You see, in a fit of madness sent by Hera, Heracles killed his wife and children. The punishment? Service. Labour. Tasks so monstrous they might as well have been death sentences. And even after completing them, he didn't get peace. His life ended in agony, poisoned by a tunic soaked in centaur blood, a gift from his second wife, who had been tricked into thinking it would ensure his fidelity. He died on a pyre, flames consuming the mortal half of him, the divine half ascending to Olympus. Yes, the gods welcomed him in the end, but only after they had burned him down to his bones. Then there's Jason. Handsome, charming, ambitious Jason. He assembled the finest team in mythology, the Argonauts, and sailed off to win the Golden Fleece. It was a dazzling journey. Monsters, clashing rocks, enchanted lands, and of course Medea, the brilliant, terrifying sorceress who helped him succeed, killed for him, betrayed her family for him. And what did he do when they returned? He married another woman, Medea responded, as Medea does, by murdering their children and leaving him broken and alone. Jason, once so glorious, died years later when a beam from his rotting ship fell and crushed him. A hero, forgotten, killed not by war or wrath, but by neglect and gravity. These men, lion-hearted, battle-scarred, were never truly safe. Not from monsters, nor from their friends, nor even from their own choices. Their greatness didn't protect them. In fact, it often attracted the worst. The gods were quick to take offence at mortals who gained too much glory. After all, divine attention was rarely a compliment. Ask Bellerophon. He was a proper hero. Tamer of Pegasus, slayer of the Chimera. A man favoured by the gods. And then one day he decided to fly Pegasus up to Olympus. Not to conquer, just to visit. It did not go well. Zeus sent a gadfly to sting the horse. Bellerophon fell. Survived, technically, but was crippled, blind, and lived out his days wandering alone, hated by gods and men alike. Because the one thing a mortal must never do is try to sit at the table of the divine. That's not to say heroism wasn't admired. The Greeks celebrated it in song and sculpture. But there was always a sense of danger about it. A sense that to rise too high was to invite the fall. And nowhere is that clearer than in the story of Ajax, a giant among men, a warrior of unmatched strength and courage. After Achilles' death, his armour was to be awarded to the next greatest Greek. Ajax expected it. Odysseus received it. Humiliated, maddened, Ajax plotted revenge. But Athena clouded his mind. He slaughtered livestock, thinking they were his comrades. When he came to his senses, grief-stricken and dishonoured, he fell on his own sword. No enemy defeated him, only shame. It's important to understand how the Greeks viewed glory, kleos, as they called it. It was not just fame, it was the legacy of your deeds. What would be remembered after you were gone? What poets would sing? What statues would show? And because the afterlife was, frankly, rather dismal, grey fields, wandering shades, no wine to speak of, kleos was the only immortality that mattered. To be forgotten was worse than death. And so heroes chased danger, risked everything. They weren't reckless because they were foolish. They were desperate for meaning, for memory, for a life that would echo. And yet, there's a quiet sadness to it all. Odysseus, for instance, won the war at Troy through cunning. The Trojan horse was his idea, and after the war, he spent 10 years trying to get home, battling storms, monsters, temptations, all because he had once boasted that his triumphs were his own, and Poseidon took that very personally. Even when he reached Ithaca at last, his troubles weren't over. He had to slaughter a houseful of suitors, rebuild trust with his wife, reassert his kingship. It was never over. Not really. Because in Greek myth, the hero never gets to rest. And when they do, it often means they're dead. Even the great Perseus, who slew Medusa and rescued Andromeda, ends not in triumph, but in obscurity. His victories made him famous, yes, but he fades from the story, settles down, vanishes from the epic stage. Glory, it seems, has an expiration date. The women of mythology, too, had their share of heroic suffering. Though less often sung by bards, their stories are no less seared by pain. Atalanta, for example, swiftest of runners, deadliest of hunters. She swore never to marry unless beaten in a foot race. Many tried, all failed. Until one man, Hippomenes, used golden apples from Aphrodite to distract her. He won, they married, and then caught in a moment of passion, they made love in a sacred temple. The gods, of course, were not amused. They were turned into lions, forever circling, never resting. So many Greek heroes ended up transformed, not exalted but altered, humbled, made into animals or stars or flowers, their stories twisted by divine hands into reminders for the rest of us. Be brave, yes, but not too brave. Be famous, yes, but not too proud. Live brightly, but do not outshine the gods. Even those who served the gods directly could not count on safety. Asclepius, son of Apollo, became so skilled in healing that he learned to raise the dead. A noble calling, perhaps, but one that annoyed Hades. Death was, after all, part of the cosmic order. So Zeus killed him with a thunderbolt. Apollo retaliated by killing the Cyclopes who made the bolt. In turn, Zeus banished Apollo to serve as a mortal shepherd, a cascade of punishment. Even the divine could be demoted, the heroic undone. And yet, despite all this, the danger, the madness, the inevitable fall, mortals still aspired to be heroes. They volunteered for quests, they prayed for signs, they followed omens into forests full of fangs and fire, because obscurity was worse, cowardice unthinkable, a quiet life almost shameful. The Greeks didn't want safe stories. They wanted ones worth telling. And so, over and over, mortals gave themselves to the gods and the monsters and the wars and the wounds. Not for peace, but for song. The bards remembered them. We remember them. They were chewed up by myth, yes, but they were not forgotten. They were heroic, and they were disposable. But perhaps, just perhaps, they knew that going in. Love, they say, makes the world go round. But in Greek mythology, it more often sends it spinning wildly off course than straight into a ditch. Because in the world of gods and mortals, love wasn't the soft, rose-petalled notion we like to imagine today. It was far more treacherous, a force of nature, or worse, a divine weapon. It could bless, yes, but more often it ruined. And for mortals, falling in love, or worse, being loved by a god, was one of the most dangerous things that could possibly happen. Let's begin with a cautionary tale, one of the most beautiful, Pygmalion, a sculptor from Cyprus, gifted and solitary. He carved a statue of a woman, not just beautiful, but perfect. So perfect, in fact, that he fell in love with her, whispered to her, brought her gifts, dressed her in fine robes. A little odd, perhaps, but harmless enough. Then he went to the temple of Aphrodite and asked gently, reverently, for a bride like the statue. The goddess, amused or perhaps flattered, answered. The statue came to life. A happy ending, one might think. But look closer. Pygmalion didn't fall in love with a woman. He created one. She had no past, no family, no memories. She existed only to please him. The Greeks didn't bother to give her a name until Roman poets did centuries later. Love, in this case, was not a relationship. It was possession, dressed in poetry. But far more often, love in myth wasn't about creation. It was about punishment. Take Narcissus. A young man so stunning that people fell in love with him on sight. But he showed no interest, no affection, no kindness. One rejected soul prayed to the gods for vengeance, and they delivered it. Narcissus came to a still pool, saw his own reflection, fell in love. Unable to touch the image, unable to look away, he withered, died, and where he fell a flower grew, delicate, pale, always bowing toward the water. The Greeks knew what we now call toxic self-regard, but they turned it into a myth, a warning, softly blooming by the riverbank. Then there's poor Echo, a nymph who talked too much. By some accounts, she used to distract Hera, while Zeus conducted his usual affairs. When Hera discovered the trick, she cursed Echo so she could only repeat what others said. She met Narcissus, loved him, silently, helplessly, repeated his words back to him like a plea, and when he spurned her, she faded, only her voice remained. Love, in Greek mythology, was not a gentle bond between equals. It was more often a trap. Consider Orpheus and Eurydice, a poet, a lyre player, a man whose music could charm birds from trees and tears from stone. When Eurydice died, bitten by a serpent on their wedding day, Orpheus did what no mortal had dared. He went to the Underworld to fetch her back. He played, he pleaded, and for once the gods listened. They let her go. On one condition, he must not look back at her until they reached the upper world. He agreed, walked ahead, listened to her footsteps behind. But doubt crept in. What if she wasn't there? What if they'd tricked him? He turned, and in that instant, Eurydice was gone, again. This time forever. He lived on, played on, until in one version he was torn apart by Maenads, wild women of Dionysus, because he would no longer love anyone but his lost bride. Even when the love was mutual, the story rarely ended well. Take Phaedra and Hippolytus. He was handsome, chaste, devoted to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt and of purity. His stepmother, Phaedra, was cursed by Aphrodite to fall in love with him. An impossible, shameful desire. She fought it, hid it, but eventually confessed. And when he rejected her, she took her own life, leaving a note claiming he had assaulted her. Theseus, his father, cursed him. Poseidon sent a sea monster. Hippolytus died, dragged by his chariot horses along the rocks. Aphrodite and Artemis, the goddesses who stood behind the drama, ended the tale by mourning their respective champions. Love, once again, proved fatal. And of course, there's the story of Paris and Helen. He was a Trojan prince. She, the most beautiful woman in the world, and very much married. Paris awarded a golden apple to Aphrodite in a divine beauty contest, and she gave him Helen in return. It was not a gentle elopement. It was an abduction, or perhaps a seduction, depending on which version you read. But either way, it was enough to launch 1,000 ships. The Trojan War followed. 10 years of slaughter, cities burned, heroes died. All for one woman and one ill-advised divine bribe. To love in myth was to gamble. To be loved, even more so. Especially if the lover was a god. Zeus, of course, was the most infamous. He appeared to mortals as a bull, a swan, a shower of gold, an eagle, a cloud. Romantic, perhaps, if you ignore the implications. His lovers suffered. Semele was incinerated. Io was turned into a cow. Leda bore children who hatched from eggs. Europa was carried across the sea. Danae conceived Perseus in a locked chamber. And Callisto, after being seduced or assaulted, depending on the version, was turned into a bear. Her son nearly killed her. The gods finally placed them in the stars, Ursa Major and Minor. A consolation prize, if ever there was one. Aphrodite herself was no gentler. When she fell in love with the mortal Anchises, she warned him not to tell anyone. He did, bragged about it, and was struck by lightning, or made lame, or blinded. The myths vary, but the moral does not. Even being loved by a goddess could ruin you. There's a strange logic to all of this. Love, in the Greek imagination, wasn't controllable. It wasn't rational. It was divine madness. Eros. Not the soft affection of Odin romance, but a kind of possession. When you were in love, you were no longer yourself. And that, in a society that prized moderation, dignity, and restraint, was deeply unsettling. The god Eros, or Cupid, as the Romans later called him, was not a cherub. He was a force, a spark of chaos. To be struck by his arrows was to lose your will, your reason, your control. And mortals, bound as they were by duty and fate, could not afford to lose control. Even in history, this theme persisted. The Greeks saw love as something that could be both civilizing and destructive. Marriage was a social contract, important, yes, sacred even, but passion, eros, was something else. Dangerous, powerful, not to be trusted. In their dramas, love leads to downfall. In their temples, it's a force to be worshipped carefully. And in their myths, it is almost always tragic. Psyche, a mortal princess, was so beautiful that people stopped worshipping Aphrodite. The goddess, furious, sent Eros to make her fall in love with a monster. but Eros fell in love with her himself. He visited her at night in darkness, never revealing his face. She was forbidden to look. Of course she did. He fled. She wandered the earth, performing impossible tasks to win him back. Eventually they were reunited. She was made immortal. One of the rare happy endings, but only after a great deal of divine humiliation, grief, and symbolic death. So why, one might ask, did the Greeks keep telling these stories? Because love, to them, was never safe, but it was always real. It was the crack in the armour, the madness in the king, the pull between mortal and divine. They feared it, revered it, wrapped it in myth so they might understand it, or at least contain it. And perhaps that's why love remains so compelling in their stories. Not because it leads to joy, but because it leads somewhere. Downward, inward, forward, into ruin, into glory, into madness. For the mortal caught in the grip of love, there was no map, no safe path. Only the hope that the gods would look away just this once. But they rarely did. Because for them, love was a tool, a game, and for mortals, it was a trap. You'd think, after everything, the curses, the monsters, the heartbreak, and the gods with personal vendettas, that mortals in Greek mythology might be rewarded with something a little gentler after death. A nice rest, a sun-dappled meadow, perhaps a reunion with loved ones and a bit of harp music in the background. But no, because in Greek mythology, death wasn't the end of suffering. It was the beginning of something far more bureaucratic. The afterlife was not heaven. It was not hell. It was mostly grey. And if you were a mortal, even a decent one, the best you could usually hope for after dying was to become a mildly confused shade, wandering aimlessly across a dull plain for eternity, without sunlight, identity, or purpose. Welcome to the Asphodel Meadows. This was the Greek default. Not a place of torture, not exactly, but neither was it comforting. It was bland, unchanging. A sort of cosmic waiting room, where the dead drifted about like leaves in a windless forest, remembering less and less as the centuries rolled by. You weren't punished, you simply were. And if that sounds bleak, well, it was. But let's back up a little. Let's talk logistics. When a person died, their soul, the psyche, separated from the body and made its way to the underworld, guided by Hermes, who handled, among other things, the delivery of souls. One imagines him like a sort of mythological courier, stylish and swift, if perhaps a bit impersonal. The soul would arrive at the banks of the river Styx, where Charon, the grim-faced ferryman, awaited with his boat. Payment was expected, usually an obol, a coin placed under the tongue or on the eyes of the deceased at burial. Those without proper burial, or without the coin, were doomed to wander the shore for 100 years, voiceless and unable to cross. A chilling thought, really. The journey to the afterlife could be delayed simply by a careless undertaker. Once ferried across the river, assuming everything went smoothly, the soul would enter the realm of Hades. Not the god himself, though he was there too, in a distant, shadowy palace, but the place, the underworld, guarded by Cerberus, the three-headed hound who let you in, but most certainly not out. And here your fate was decided. But not by gods, not usually. The Greek afterlife had a staff, 3 judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, mortals once, but now the eternal arbiters of the dead. They examined your life, your deeds, your crimes, your sacrifices, and based on this celestial audit, you were sorted. If you were truly vile, a betrayer, a murderer, a blasphemer of extraordinary talent, you might be sent to Tartarus. Not just a deep pit, but the pit. A vast abyss of torment, located even below Hades itself. Here, the worst offenders endured punishments designed not just for pain, but for poetic symmetry. Tantalus, who murdered his own son and served him to the gods, was made to stand forever in a pool of water beneath a fruit tree. But whenever he reached for the fruit or bent to drink, they slipped just out of reach. He was forever hungry, forever thirsty, forever tantalized. Sisyphus, who cheated death twice, once by tricking Thanatos, the spirit of death, and once by convincing his wife not to bury him, was condemned to roll a boulder uphill for all eternity. Each time it neared the summit, it rolled back down. The punishment wasn't just hard labour, it was the futility of effort, the endless repetition of hope undone. Then there was Ixion. He tried to seduce Hera, not a wise move. Zeus bound him to a flaming wheel that spins without end, an eternal reminder that some mortal ambitions were simply not worth the risk. But here's the thing, these were rare fates. Tartarus was not overcrowded. Most souls were not evil enough for torment, nor good enough for reward. Which brings us back to the Asphodel Meadows, the realm of the ordinary dead, the decent, the forgettable, the ones who paid their taxes, said their prayers, and didn't cause too much trouble. They simply drifted. And as the centuries passed, they forgot who they were. Forgotten by the living, unremarkable among the dead, they faded. Not erased. The Greeks didn't believe in annihilation, but reduced, diminished, present, but without sharpness. It wasn't punishment. It was entropy. But not all souls ended there. A fortunate few, heroes, the exceptionally just, or those favoured by the gods, were granted entry into the Elysian fields. Now this, finally, was something approaching reward, a land of endless spring, gentle breezes, music, feasts, athletic contests, if you fancied a bit of running after death, the elite of the afterlife. Achilles was there, though, in Homer's telling, he wasn't exactly thrilled about it. When Odysseus visits the underworld and speaks to Achilles, the great warrior says he would rather be a living servant to a poor man than a king among the dead, which rather dampens the appeal. Still, the Elysian fields offered peace, if not pleasure. And if you lived particularly well, or were reincarnated and lived well again, you might be allowed to stay there forever. A sort of celestial retirement plan for the morally consistent. The Greeks did, in time, entertain the idea of reincarnation. Plato, ever the philosopher, wrote of souls being judged, then choosing their next life based on the lessons learned. A philosopher might become a king. A tyrant, perhaps, a dung beetle. Your fate, in this telling, was shaped by what you valued. Wisdom led to clarity. Vanity led to repetition. It was not universal belief, more a philosophical add-on, but it showed that even the Greeks longed for some sense of justice beyond the grave. Still, for most, the underworld remained what it always had been, a place of silence. There was no divine light, no reward for faith. The gods of Olympus lived forever, but mortals, even beloved mortals, sank into shadow. Even the heroes who visited the underworld, Odysseus, Aeneas, Orpheus, came away changed, haunted. It was not a place you left without consequence. And mortals who tried to cheat death? Well, they rarely succeeded. Orpheus, as we've seen, looked back too soon. Persephone, stolen by Hades, ate 6 seeds of a pomegranate and was bound to return each year. Even Heracles, who went to fetch Cerberus as one of his labours, barely escaped unscathed. Death, in Greek thought, was not evil. It was inevitable, unavoidable. It did not judge or weep or rage. It simply came. Thanatos, the spirit of death, was not cruel. He was quiet, pale, winged. He did not chase, he arrived. And when he did, your story ended. Or rather, it continued. Just without plot. The funeral rituals reflected this view. The Greeks took burial seriously. It wasn't about grief alone. It was necessity. To be unburied was to be trapped, restless, cut off. Even enemies were sometimes buried by their foes, simply to ensure their souls wouldn't linger. And libations, offerings poured into the earth, were common. Wine, milk, honey, olive oil. Not because the dead could drink them, but because it kept the bond intact. The living honoured the dead, and in doing so reminded themselves that their own journey would someday lead below. So they prayed, sacrificed, built tombs, whispered names. Not out of fear precisely, but out of duty. Because the afterlife, though quiet, was not entirely empty. And memory in the Greek imagination was the only thing that could truly outlive death. If no one remembered you, you faded. If they did, if they told your stories, visited your grave, spoke your name, you lingered. Dimly, softly, but still. And so the greatest fear was not fire or punishment. It was being forgotten. That's why heroes chased glory. Why poets wrote epics. Why names were carved into stone. Because even if the gods ignored you, even if fate consumed you, perhaps someone somewhere would remember. And in that memory you would remain. Just a little longer. Imagine, if you will, living every moment of your life with the unsettling feeling that someone is watching you. Not just someone, dozens of someones. From the sky, the sea, the forest, the hearth, the sun, the shadows. Some are interested in your offerings. Some are interested in your mistakes. And all of them have opinions. That was the world of a mortal in ancient Greece. The gods weren't distant. They didn't reside in some heavenly realm beyond the clouds, emerging only for cosmic events. No, they were everywhere, in every flame, breeze, groan of timber, rustle of olive leaf. They were always watching. And more troubling still, they were judging. They noticed everything. What you offered. What you said. What you didn't say. Whether you were clean. Whether you were honest. Whether you looked the wrong direction during a festival, or sneezed at the wrong moment in a temple. They watched you because you mattered, and also because you didn't. The gods, after all, had a tendency to fixate on mortals the way children fixate on ants. Fascinated, occasionally kind, often cruel. Even if you weren't a hero or a villain, even if you were just a simple fisherman or potter or widow selling figs at the market, you still lived under their gaze. And that meant you were always one missed prayer away from misfortune. Take Actaeon, a perfectly decent young man, a hunter, a man fond of dogs and the quiet of the woods. One day, while wandering in the forest, he happened to stumble upon a glade. A soft breeze moved through the trees. Birds chirped, and there, bathing in a secluded pool, was Artemis, goddess of the hunt, the moon, and fiercely guarded chastity. He did not speak. He did not stare. He simply saw her. That was enough. She turned. Her eyes met his. And without a word, she transformed him into a stag. His own dogs, loyal, sharp-toothed, and now very confused, tore him to pieces. The message was clear. Innocence was not a defence. The gods were watching, and they did not take kindly to being seen. Then there's the story of Baucis and Philemon, a rare happy tale, but one with a sharp edge. Zeus and Hermes, disguised as poor travellers, wandered from door to door in a village, seeking shelter. House after house turned them away. Some mocked them, some slammed the door. Only one cottage opened, a humble home shared by an elderly couple. They had little, but they gave freely: bread, olives, wine, and kindness. And so the gods, having revealed themselves, rewarded them. They turned the rude neighbours' homes to ash, flooded the village. Baucis and Philemon were spared, their cottage transformed into a temple. They were made priests, and when they died, they became two trees, intertwined forever. It's a sweet story, but behind the blessing is a darker truth. The gods were testing you, secretly, constantly, and you never knew when. It might be a beggar at your table, a stranger at the crossroads, a coin dropped on the road. Pass the test, and you might be honoured. Fail, and you might be turned into a tree, or a statue, or dust. There was no formal notice, no warning sign, no heavenly voice saying, "This is a test." You simply had to assume that the gods were watching, and that they were not easily impressed. Hospitality, xenia, as it was known, was sacred. To mistreat a guest was to insult Zeus himself, who was said to protect strangers and wanderers. But the same went for offerings, for sacrifices, for public festivals. Everything had to be done properly. The right words, the right steps, the right incense. And if it wasn't, well, perhaps the crops would fail. Perhaps your ship would sink. Perhaps your firstborn would cough once, then never again. There was no divine memo, no official notification that you'd offended a god. You had to piece it together. Was it Hera? Was it Apollo? Was it because you poured the wine with your left hand? There's a kind of divine paranoia embedded in ancient Greek life. Not neurotic fear, exactly, but a constant awareness that every action had meaning, and every oversight might carry consequences. And with so many gods, Olympians, Titans, river gods, tree spirits, household deities, nymphs of spring and stream, the chances of accidentally offending one were, frankly, rather high. Even saying a god's name in the wrong context could cause trouble. The poet Hesiod warned of speaking ill of the gods after dark. Night was sacred. Silence was better. Safer. And yet, silence too could be dangerous. Because what if the gods expected thanks? Or tribute? Or song? And so, mortals lived in a kind of delicate balancing act, speaking just enough, offering just enough, fearing just enough. Too much reverence, and you might seem insincere. Too little, and you'd seem ungrateful. It was a kind of cosmic etiquette. And the gods, like all finicky dinner guests, paid very close attention to manners. Then there were the temples. Grand, beautiful spaces of marble and gold and flickering flame. But also homes, the gods' homes. And like any guest, you had to behave. You had to wash, to dress properly, to bring gifts, and above all, to mean it. Because the gods weren't just watching your actions, they were watching your heart. Piety was not a checklist, it was a posture of being, and mortals were expected to hold that posture forever. Even the festivals, which could be joyful, were serious business. The Dionysia, for example, with its theatre and wine and revelry, wasn't just a party, it was a religious act. If you laughed too much at the wrong play, or didn't laugh at all, it could be seen as an insult. Your enjoyment, your laughter, your participation, all part of the offering. Even at weddings and funerals, the gods were present, watching, judging. Did the bride offer properly to Hera? Was Hermes honoured for guiding the dead? Were the laments sung loudly enough? Did the family remember to purify the house afterwards? Every detail mattered, because in Greek mythology, the gods did not need your affection, but they demanded your respect, and they were always ready to correct you. Sometimes the judgment came quietly. A sudden illness, a failed harvest, a fishless season. Other times it came dramatically. A storm at sea, a madness in the family, a voice in the night, and once in a while it came with lightning, because Zeus did love a good thunderbolt. Even historians of the time, like Herodotus, recorded events with divine judgment in mind. A king fell? Clearly he'd offended the gods. A city burned? Someone must have grown too proud. There was always a moral to the misfortune, always a finger pointing skyward, and so people told stories, remembered missteps, warned children, left small offerings on windowsills, whispered apologies to trees, sprinkled libations into the earth, just in case. Because when the gods were angry, they might destroy you. But when they were merely curious, that could be worse. Curiosity led to tests, to games, to strange dreams and stranger omens, to impossible choices with no right answer. And still, mortals played along. They told their myths, built their temples, painted their pots with stories of judgment and justice and divine caprice. Not because they loved their gods, but because they understood them. The gods were like storms, beautiful, unpredictable, necessary. And so long as you honoured them, or at least tried to, perhaps they'd pass over your house without striking. Perhaps, but there were no guarantees, because the gods were watching, and they were always judging. There is a unique kind of cruelty in knowing your fate, and being utterly powerless to change it. That, in essence, was the Greek prophecy. Not a warning to be avoided, not a guide to be followed, but a sentence spoken aloud. In mythology, prophecies weren't meant to help you. They were meant to trap you. They didn't just tell the future. They ensured it would happen. Even the act of trying to escape a prophecy was, more often than not, the very thing that fulfilled it. For mortals, this was particularly agonizing, because the gods might tell you what was coming, but they would never, under any circumstance, explain how to survive it. Take, for example, the most famous case of all, Oedipus, a prince born in Thebes. A child prophesied to kill his father and marry his mother. His parents, understandably horrified, tried to kill him, a standard reaction in mythology. They pierced his ankles, tied him up, and left him on a mountain to die. But fate is rather good at navigating mountains. A shepherd found him, raised him far away in Corinth, unaware of his true origins. And one day, when Oedipus himself heard the prophecy, he did what seemed logical. He ran, fled Corinth, determined never to return, so he might avoid killing his father. On the road, he quarrelled with a stranger, the kind of heated, masculine misunderstanding one expects at a crossroads. He killed the man. Later he arrived in Thebes, saved the city from the Sphinx, married the queen, and slowly, terribly, the truth emerged. The man he'd killed, his real father, the queen, his mother. The prophecy had come true, not because he ignored it, but because he tried to stop it. That, you see, is how Greek prophecy works. It does not lie, but it never helps. It tells you what, never how, and certainly never why. Even heroes were not exempt. Take Perseus. The prophecy said he would kill his grandfather, Acrisius. So Acrisius, naturally, locked his daughter, Danae, in a bronze chamber to prevent her from ever having children. Zeus, always up for a challenge, entered the chamber anyway, as a shower of gold. Mythology is full of these sorts of unorthodox relationships. Perseus was born, sent away, grew up, became a hero. Years later, at some friendly games, he threw a discus. A stray wind, a bad bounce. The discus flew into the crowd and struck his grandfather dead. Prophecy fulfilled. No malice, no design. Just fate doing what fate does. Then there's Croesus, the famously wealthy king of Lydia. Before waging war against the Persians, he consulted the oracle at Delphi, as one did. The oracle told him, if you cross the river, a great empire will fall. Croesus, confident, charged into battle, and he lost. The empire that fell was his own. The message was accurate, just not in the way he'd hoped. The Greeks understood this paradox. They didn't see fate as a riddle to be solved, but as a thread to be followed, whether you liked it or not. The Moirai, the Fates, were 3 ancient goddesses who governed every mortal's life. Clotho spun the thread. Lachesis measured it. Atropos cut it. Even the gods respected them. Even Zeus. Because fate was older than Olympus, older than time. And the oracles, those haunted priestesses who spoke the will of Apollo, were not inventing their words, they were merely translating. The most famous oracle, of course, was the Pythia at Delphi. She sat on a tripod over a chasm in the temple floor, inhaling vapours, probably from naturally occurring gases, and spoke in riddles. Kings consulted her before wars, generals before campaigns, farmers before planting, and she would answer, but always vaguely. Always with just enough ambiguity to keep things interesting. Ask how long you'll live, and she might say, when the eagle leaves its nest, so too shall your flame go out. Ask if your son will return from battle, and she might reply, he will bring glory to your name, though not your house. Technically true, practically useless. It wasn't that the gods enjoyed confusing mortals. Well, actually, they did enjoy it a little. But prophecy for them was more like theatre. A carefully written script where mortals played their roles. And no one, not even the protagonist, could skip a line. This made life rather tense for those who were prophesied about. Take Paris of Troy. At his birth, a prophecy warned he would bring about the destruction of his city. So he was abandoned on a hillside. A recurring theme. But of course, he survived. Grew up. Became handsome, charming, rather fond of judging divine beauty contests. 1 golden apple, 1 seduction of Helen, 1 10-year war later, prophecy fulfilled. Troy burned. All because a baby was fated to cause ruin. And because mortals, in trying to prevent it, made it inevitable. It's tempting to think of prophecy as a trap. But the Greeks didn't quite see it that way. They saw it as Moira, your portion, your lot. Something not to be escaped, but to be understood. In fact, the truly tragic characters weren't the ones who tried to defy fate. They were the ones who never learned what it was. Take Agamemnon. He returned home from Troy, victorious, proud, utterly unaware that his wife Clytemnestra planned to murder him in his bath. There was no prophecy warning him, no divine whisper, just the slow march of consequences. For a war he started, a daughter he sacrificed, a kingdom he neglected. In a way, the silence was worse than the omen. At least when the gods speak, you know what's coming. But prophecy wasn't just a tool of tragedy. Sometimes it was a mechanism for power. Kings claimed divine approval through oracles. Founders of colonies sought signs. Even Socrates, the philosopher, was famously told by the oracle at Delphi that no man was wiser than he. He spent the rest of his life trying to prove it wrong, and, in doing so, proved it right. That was the great irony of Greek prophecy. It revealed truth not by clarifying, but by challenging. You understood it only after it happened. Only after the bodies were counted. The temples burned, the throne vacant. Only then did someone somewhere say, "Ah, so that's what it meant." And so mortals learned to live with uncertainty. They consulted oracles, yes, but they also built contingency plans. They made sacrifices, read omens in bird flight, burned bones and studied the cracks. A priestess might interpret the bleating of a goat. A general might base a military decision on the way a chicken pecked at grain. If that sounds ridiculous, remember, they weren't looking for certainty. They were looking for alignment, a sense that their actions fit the will of fate. Because if the gods approved, or seemed to, perhaps things would go well. And if they didn't, at least the disaster would be dignified. Even mythology's cleverest mortals, Odysseus for instance, never outwitted prophecy. They navigated it, delayed it, danced around its edges. But the thread was always waiting to be cut, and no one, not even the tricksters, escaped in the end. There is something terribly human in this. To long for knowledge, to receive it in part, and to realize that knowledge alone does not grant control. To know that the future is written, and still to hope that maybe, just maybe, it isn't written in ink. Some mortals went mad from prophecy. Cassandra, of course, saw everything, and could change nothing. Others, like Laius and Jocasta, acted decisively, boldly, and made things worse. And a few simply walked forward, like Achilles. He knew his fate, knew he would die young, knew his name would live on, while his life would be cut short. And he chose it. That's the strange mercy of prophecy. It tells you the end, but it never tells you what kind of person you'll be when you meet it. And so, in the space between the knowing and the arriving, mortals lived, loved, fought, failed, sang, died, and somewhere, far above or deep within, the gods watched and smiled. Because prophecy, after all, was not just a sentence. It was a story. And mortals? They played their parts beautifully. If you were a mortal in ancient Greece, you likely accepted a few basic truths. The gods were powerful. Fate was inevitable. Monsters existed. And somewhere, somehow, the end of the world was coming. Or at least, the end of your world. Because in Greek mythology, when things went wrong, truly wrong, it was never the gods who paid the price. It was the mortals. They suffered first, and they suffered most. You could be a farmer planting barley, or a sailor watching the coast fade, or a mother brushing olive oil onto her child's hair. And, without warning, the gods could decide that your city, your field, your life was finished. Not from malice necessarily. Sometimes from boredom. Sometimes as a warning to others. Sometimes as the side effect of a squabble between two immortals about who forgot the libation last festival. The reasons didn't matter much. The consequences always did. Let's begin then with the flood. Not Noah's, but Deucalion's, the Greek version. You see, once upon a time, humans had become, in Zeus's eyes, a bit unruly, loud, ungrateful. Too many festivals gone unobserved. Too many sacrifices skimped. The gods had given them fire, taught them farming, let them name the stars. And how did they repay it? By being irritating. So Zeus, rather characteristically, decided to wipe them out. He unleashed a great flood, a deluge that covered the earth. Temples sank, herds drowned, cities vanished beneath the waves. Only 2 mortals survived, Deucalion and his wife, Pyrrha. Not because they were particularly strong or cunning or rich, but because they were pious. Zeus gave them a warning. They built a chest, not a grand ship, just a watertight box. They floated as the world drowned, and when the waters receded, they stepped onto a barren, empty world, alone, alive, exhausted. To repopulate the earth, they were told to throw the bones of their mother behind them, a riddle naturally. They realized this meant the stones of Gaia, the earth. As they threw the stones, they transformed into people, the new human race, stone-born, hardy, no longer made of gold or silver or bronze, as earlier mythic races had been, but of rock, tough, durable, slightly miserable. The flood myth wasn't unique to Greece, but its moral was telling. When the world ends, the gods start over. But the mortals, they have to rebuild, from nothing, with no help. Then there's the tale of Pandora. Ah, Pandora, the first woman, crafted by Hephaestus, blessed by the gods with beauty, grace, and curiosity, and gifted a jar, or, as it's more famously mistranslated, a box. She was told not to open it. Naturally she did, and from it poured every sorrow known to humankind: disease, famine, war, grief, madness, aging. All the things the golden race had never known. Hope fluttered out last, whether as comfort or cruel joke depends on how you read it. But the point is clear. The gods gave mortals the tools of suffering, sometimes directly, sometimes wrapped in something lovely. Pandora wasn't evil. She wasn't even malicious. She was simply human, and the punishment, as always, fell on everyone else. Even Prometheus, who loved mortals and gave them fire, was punished, chained to a rock, liver devoured daily by an eagle. Not because he had destroyed anything, but because he had helped. Helping mortals, it seemed, was a serious offence, and yet mortals kept living, kept working, worshipping, hoping. Perhaps because hope had slipped out of the jar too. But the gods didn't need an apocalypse to end a world. Sometimes they simply turned away. Demeter, for instance. When her daughter Persephone was taken by Hades into the Underworld, Demeter, goddess of the harvest, wandered the earth in mourning. Crops failed. Famine spread. The green world turned brown. Mortals starved, not because they sinned, but because a mother grieved. Eventually, a compromise was struck. Persephone would spend part of the year above, part below. And so came the seasons. Spring and summer, when the daughter returns. Autumn and winter, when she descends. It's a beautiful myth, but one built on the bones of the hungry. Even in their sadness, the gods had consequences. Then there were wars. The Trojan War wasn't just a clash of men and swords. It was divine theatre. Aphrodite gave Helen to Paris. Hera and Athena snubbed, supported the Greeks. Zeus watched, occasionally amused, occasionally bored, and as the gods chose sides, mortals died: Achilles, Hector, Patroclus, Ajax, thousands unnamed. A city fell, a king lost his homecoming, a queen plotted her revenge. And why? Because a mortal judged a divine beauty contest. One poor choice, one golden apple, one compliment tossed to the wrong immortal. And the world burned. The gods, in their way, were always reenacting creation and destruction. Every war was a mini-apocalypse. Every slight a chance to unravel everything. Mortals weren't consulted. They were simply caught in the blast radius. Even love could end the world. Ask Semele. She was a mortal woman, seduced by Zeus. Hera, jealous, tricked her into asking Zeus to reveal his true form. He did. She was vaporized by divine radiance. Her unborn child, Dionysus, was saved, sewn into Zeus's thigh, because myths are rarely tidy. Semele's death wasn't malicious. It was technical. She wasn't built to see a god bear his power. Mortals never are. Then there's the madness. The gods could break a mortal mind as easily as snapping a reed. Take Heracles, the greatest hero, strongest of men. Driven mad by Hera, he slaughtered his wife and children. The world ended in that moment for him. And though he atoned, though he performed 12 impossible labours and was eventually made a god himself, the cost was unbearable. For the mortals in his story there was no redemption arc. Only blood. Only silence. The Greek worldview was not without hope, but it was shaped by resignation. Mortals lived in a world that was not built for them. They lived on borrowed land, under borrowed sky, at the mercy of beings who did not always know, or care, what their actions cost. And when the gods lost interest? Well, then things got truly dangerous. A neglected ritual, a missed omen, a slighted shrine. Any of these could lead to plagues, storms, madness, crop failure. The gods didn't need to rage. They simply had to stop listening. The end of a mortal world wasn't a fiery conclusion. It was silence from Olympus. And still, they prayed. To Athena for wisdom, to Apollo for healing, to Artemis for safety in childbirth. They sang the hymns, burned the fat, poured the wine. Not because they were certain it would help, but because they feared what happened when no one did. Mortals learn to live with endings. Small ones, personal ones, city walls collapsing, loved ones turning to shadows, heroes vanishing into smoke. They accepted that time was not kind, that history was not fair, that the gods had other priorities. But they told their stories, preserved the myths, painted the jars, built the temples, because telling the story in the end was all the power they had, to name the suffering, to place it in context, to turn the chaos into something resembling sense. So when the world ended, as it often did, in pieces, at least it could be remembered, sung, shared. Even the end, the Greeks knew, could be made beautiful, if only in hindsight. And that, perhaps, was the only comfort a mortal could rely on. The gods would do what they pleased. But the mortals? They would make meaning of it. They would gather the ashes and write it down.